My name is Peter Shapley. I'm Professor of Modern British History at Bangor University, and I'd like to welcome you to the first of 3 seminars being held to look at various aspects of the context around the Grenfell Tower fire. So over the next 3 weeks, we will be looking at some of the economic, some of the management issues, some of the long-term policies from government, central and local, and some of the underlying social causes that underpin the Grenfell Tower fire, as well as the regulatory systems and issues around procurement. So I hope you'll join us next week and the week after as well. And you can also follow us on hashtag Grenfell Inquiry Seminar. These sessions have been organised by Adrian Williamson QC, Sam Steen QC, who represents the bereaved survivors and the relatives of the victims, by Dr. Judy Stevenson, who's at UCL's Bartlett School and who specialises in the economic history of early modern London and its building industry, and Dr. Vanessa Davis, former academic, senior civil servant, and for 10 years up until earlier this year, the Director General of the Bar Standards Board, and now a regulatory consultant. I'd like to thank them and our admin support officer, Mrs. Tracy Williams, for putting together such a great series of seminars. Now, I particularly want to welcome all those affected directly or indirectly by the tragedy of the fire. And I'd like to begin by inviting you all just to pause just for a few seconds as a mark of respect for all those who lost their lives. Thank you. Okay, thank you. Now, I think it's important that we remember the events around which these seminars are being held, the tragedy and the inquiry. So in the early hours of 14th of June 2017, a fire broke out in the kitchen of flat 16 on the 4th floor of Grenfell Tower, a residential high-rise block of flats located in the Lancaster West Estate in North Kensington, W11. The block sits inside one of the richest neighbourhoods in Europe. Within a matter of hours, the majority of the tower was substantially destroyed, with the tragic loss of 72 lives. This was the worst loss of life to fire in domestic premises since the Second World War. A public inquiry was set up on the 15th of August 2017 to examine the circumstances leading up to and surrounding the fire under retired Judge Sir Martin Moore-Bigg. Phase 1 of the inquiry focused on the events of the night of the 14th of June 2017. Hearings for Phase 1 began on the 21st of May 2018 and concluded on the 12th of December 2018. The chairman published his Phase 1 report on the 30th of October 2019. The report was highly critical of the performance of the London Fire Brigade. However, the report also concluded that there was compelling evidence that the external walls of the building failed to comply with requirement B4 (1) of Schedule 1 to the Building Regulations 2010, in that they did not adequately resist the spread of fire having regard to the height, use and position of the building. On the contrary, they actively promoted it. Phase 2 of the inquiry is examining the causes of these events, including how Grenfell Tower came to be in a condition that allowed fire to spread in the way identified in Phase 1. Hearings for Phase 2 began in January 2020, but were suspended on the 16th of March to the 6th of July following COVID and the subsequent lockdown. Since the 6th of May, the hearings have resumed, but they proceeded on a virtual basis. The current schedule for the inquiry is being considered through a series of modules with a large number of factual and expert witnesses giving evidence. So Module 1 is dealing with the primary refurbishment, in particular the cladding, and evidence is due to conclude at the end of October 2020. Module 2 will then be concerned with testing, certification, and marketing of cladding products, and that will hear evidence from November 2020 through to January 2021. Module 3 will then deal with a variety of issues, including complaints by and communication with residents and the management team of Grenfell Tower, including active and passive fire safety measures internal to the building. This will proceed from February to May 2021. The remaining modules, which are expected to be heard in the second half of 2021, will be concerned with the aftermath of the fire, further firefighting issues, the role of national and central government, and finally further evidence from expert witnesses. The inquiry has not yet indicated when it will publish its phase 2 report, but this is not likely to be in the second half of 2022, so 5 years after the fire. Sorry, it will not likely to be before the second half of 2022, some 5 years after the fire. On the basis of the evidence heard so far, it appears that a large number of organisations and individuals will be the subject of criticism for their role in the events leading to the fire. Many of these organisations and individuals may also be subject in due course to civil or criminal proceedings. And it is a well-known concern of the survivors of the fire and their families that no possible prosecution will take place until after the inquiry report, meaning that any criminal trial may not take place until something like 10 years after the fire. Okay, however serious though that the failings may have been of such organisations and individuals, the events of the 14th of June 2017 did not occur in a vacuum. And the purpose of this series of seminars is to consider the wider context which contributed to those terrible events. So today we'll be exploring issues around class, race, poverty, and housing policies, housing legislation. For example, we'll be looking at the long-term decline and the marginalisation in the status of both the social housing and the tenants. Next week, we'll be looking and considering the historical patterns of building regulation and deregulation. And we'll be asking questions such as, did light touch regulation help to form the climate which led to the fire? In our final session, we'll be discussing the fundamental problems of coordination and of procuring building services and contracts. Did a race to the bottom in procurement contribute to the lowering of standards in the construction industry? Okay, so in terms of the seminars themselves, structure and format, we'll start today's session with Professor Miles Glendinning. He'll talk for 30 minutes. Then each speaker will talk for 15 to 20 minutes. We can take just a couple of questions or observations at the end of each paper, but we'll leave the main discussion at the end. You can use the chat function to flag any questions that you might have. And I'm ably assisted, thankfully, by Adrian Williamson, who's going to help me in managing those questions. We'll have a break at around about 12:40, and then we'll resume at 1:10. At the end, Brian Richardson will be the discussant, and Brian will be making a few observations. He will be pulling the papers together, he'll be making a few points, and then he and we will open it all up to a much broader discussion. Please keep the microphone function muted until we invite you to ask a question. Otherwise, it becomes just a lot of noise and a lot of feedback, and it's very difficult to manage. So today, our focus is on how tenants have been marginalised, how they've been held to ransom to the vagaries of the market or to public policy, both central and local government, and how they've been perceived as well and treated across the 20th century, how they became second-class citizens. We'll be looking at the rise of mass housing in London, and why areas have developed as they have over time. Again, the vagaries of the market determining the shape of an area. We'll be looking at how public policy affected the process of marginalisation. We'll look at the construct of ideas and attitudes towards tenants, particularly in the interwar period. And we'll also be looking, again, with one eye on the market, at the processes around gentrification. And finally, we'll be looking at how policies have impacted on minority groups in post-war Britain. We need to understand this context if we're going to get closer to realising how we reached this point in the first place, a point where people still suffer class and racial prejudice, and how this has and continues to affect access to housing. So first then, to open up today's session, I'd like to hand over to one of the foremost experts in the history of the Tower Block, Professor Miles Glendinning, who will be talking about the rise of mass housing in the post-war period. Okay, Miles?
Thank you.
Sorry, before you start, Miles, I've just made a mistake. Questions are going to be through the question function, not the chat function. Thank you, Adrian. So questions through the Q&A function.
Okay, can I just check first? Everybody can hear me, okay?
Yes, fine.
Right, okay. Okay, well, I think it's unambiguously clear that inequality and exclusion played a huge role in the 3 or 4 decades of residualization and so-called regeneration of council housing that preceded the Grenfell disaster, to say nothing of the more specific failures of maintenance and adaptation that contributed more directly to it. The introductory blurb to panel 1 argues that housing is both a determinant and product of inequality. And I think, speaking of the post-1980 period in Britain, that's an undeniable fact. But I'm a historian who specializes in something slightly different from that, and namely the history of the original processes of creation and production of state-supported mass housing. And not just in post-war Britain, but across the world, and over a longer time frame, which in some places actually stretches right up to the present. For example, this is a book that's about to come out about that, with Yugoslavia on the cover. That's in general a story of rise rather than decline and fall. And certainly in post-war Western and Eastern Europe, including Britain, it would be difficult to interpret those years as ones of increasing inequality rather than decreasing inequality. You could argue that in many places it was a distinctly redistributive period, even if by no means a perfect one, and that state-sponsored mass housing played a significant role in that, even although within its overall role as an agency of qualified redistribution, there were some obvious hotspots of inequality, including, as I'll explain, North Kensington. Now, in this lecture, I want to focus not so much on inequality and on generally negative interpretations of mass housing, as on the quite positive aspirations and efforts that originally helped to energize it, and on the very strong local diversity that the council housing system within Britain encouraged, contrary to the caricature of alienating sameness everywhere. My interpretation of this post-war period of creation and production is arranged a bit like a set of Russian matryoshka dolls, homing in from global to Britain, and then to London, and then finally to Kensington and Chelsea. I want to begin by putting the British council housing system in its international context, then to put London council housing in a national English and British context, and finally to put Kensington Chelsea in the London context, and showing at each stage and asking of this sequence of argumentation, does it, however obliquely and indirectly, contribute anything at all to our understanding of the context of the Grenfell disaster? I've not gone specifically into the creation and building of Grenfell itself, or the historically, as it's known, the Lancaster Road West Stage 1 development, as part of my own research, although it does feature, along with all other post-war multi-storey public housing developments in Britain, in the Tower Block UK database that we have organised at the University of Edinburgh, with HLF Heritage Lottery support a few years ago. But I do hope that my contextual focusing in argument might nevertheless cast some interesting illuminations on the Grenfell situation. So first, let's put the British system of council housing as a whole into its international context. Now, internationally, as I've just said, in general, against the caricature of homogeneity, post-war mass housing generated networks of diversity and autonomy within which an almost limitless variety of local variants could flourish within supposedly national housing systems. And in the case of Britain, the very term that's normally used for public housing, which is council housing, that indicates that it was actually built and rented out directly by local government, by councils, which is a national system that's not found anywhere else in the world. And that's the first point I want to make. It's unique to Britain. Its central decision makers were elected local politicians, and so it became bound up with local political and civic microcultures to an extreme degree. Elsewhere in the world, a much more normal pattern was a kind of arm's length decentralized approach via semi-public agencies, social companies, housing co-ops, that kind of stuff, you know, sometimes big, sometimes small. Even in the other Anglophone countries, which also featured, like Britain, a very strong polarization between public rental and private owner-occupied housing, the state in these other places tended to provide public housing not via local councils, but by semi-autonomous housing authorities or commissions. And I'll come back to them, probably the most famous of these, so-called NYCHA in New York at the end. Great Britain, and I say Great Britain because that even excludes Northern Ireland, which had a completely different system, which Great Britain was unique in giving local municipal authorities the lead role in the so-called national housing drive, directly planning, building, and managing large social housing stocks. Following its large-scale launch in 1919, this unique council housing system achieved remarkable output figures, but after World War II, even these were eclipsed. Between 1945 and 65, council housing accounted for nearly 60% of all new dwellings, which is twice the interwar percentage. Its role was strongest here in Scotland, where overall per capita public housing output from 1945 to 70 was twice the rate in England and Wales. And by the early 60s, the proportion of all new housing production directly built and managed by public agencies, which is 79%, was much higher than any other Western country, and it was much higher, for that matter, than the USSR or East Germany. In Glasgow, between 1960 and 1975, 95% of new housing was council built. But there were negative aspects to the council housing system too, right from the beginning. Post-war council housing in Britain was a direct extension of local gesture politics because it was municipal, it was a part of local politics. And that could create tremendous civic diversity, but it could also lead to wild swings in policies with changes of political control. You know, does that sound familiar? And often ridiculous amounts of overbuilding in unwanted places just for political gestures, followed predictably by mass demolitions. And, of course, it could allow hostile interventions by central governments to be made very easily, as in the 1980s under Thatcher. So that's the first of our possibly leading towards Grenfell type of little twinges there. Now, also, the organizational reliance on direct municipal building and ownership, it was spatially bound up with something else which was rather special to Britain, and that's a preoccupation with extensive inner city slum clearance. This is something that's typical of all Anglophone countries. In most other countries, it's assumed if you build large amounts of public housing, it's done in the outskirts of the city, which are thought to be the sort of depressed areas. But in Anglophone countries, you carve out areas in the center of the city. But in Britain, this was especially exaggerated, and it was dominated by the large urban municipal authorities. Now, partly this was because the early suppression of private landlords in Britain had caused faster housing decay than in many other countries. Partly it was fueled by the British tradition of polemical debate about urban conditions, with the private landlords squeezed in the middle, and both owner occupation and rented state housing going from strength to strength, the municipalities in Britain piled up ever more radical powers of slum clearance. There had been some slum clearance in the 19th century, early 20th century, but what followed in 1945 in many cities was totally different in character and scale. Gigantic demonstrations of municipal power, clearing vast expanses, often erasing their street patterns and rebuilding them on completely new layouts. This is Glasgow, which, it wasn't bombed in the war, but it looked as if it had been by 1975. this focus on the inner urban helped to generate a very distinctive architectural outcome, an idiosyncratic vernacular of modern housing, with public housing multi-story blocks in Britain tending to be concentrated in quite individualistic inner urban clumps of tall towers, usually not system built either, very unlike the rows and rows of prefabricated slab blocks on the city outskirts that are typical, for example, of France or the USSR. And I should incidentally mention this vernacular diversity is extensively covered in Stefan Matesius' and my recent book, Towers for the Welfare State, but I think Stefan will say a bit more about that in a later panel. Now, let's move on to putting London council housing in its national context. Now, the position of slum clearance was rather different in London, and I'd like to move on to the London situation now and briefly explore the more specific circumstances and constraints operating in the city, whose unique two-tier local government system encouraged very diverse, yet also at times damagingly fragmented approaches to the challenge of mass housing and planning. Now, to start off with, local politics in London in the post-war period was more overtly political than elsewhere in Britain. There were clearly defined Labour and Conservative groups in most authorities, unlike the kind of ratepayer anti-socialist groupings that dominated in many other towns and cities. And then within this system, the key thing happened in 1964-5, the local government reorganisation, which was a real watershed and a rebalancing between the two tiers of government. Before that, the all-powerful and Labour-dominated upper-tier regional authority, the London County Council, had exerted a dominant influence over the mostly scattered and weak metropolitan boroughs, and its architects and planners could impose a formula of what was called population overspill linked to slum clearance, and a strong prioritisation of individualistic architectural design at the expense of mass output. After 1964-5, the reorganisation, the new upper tier Greater London Council, with its far larger area, there it is on the bottom right, was relatively weak and ineffective. And while many Labour-controlled boroughs then began to flex their muscles and embark on city-scale housing drives, many Tory-controlled ones like Kensington and Chelsea were able to avoid doing that. Now, if the national framework of the council housing drive in Britain was dominated by civic individuality and diversity, London was even more marked by extreme individualism, both in the organisation and location of production and in its architectural form. So, for example, slum clearance was very different and rather more piecemeal in London than in places like Manchester or Glasgow. Even the biggest and most famous schemes, like the LCC schemes in the East End or Southwark's Aylesbury development, were threaded into quite scattered sites. For areas like this, the emergence of the modernist tower block in the 50s provided a bit of a godsend. It's a way of kind of decanting population and clearance that would provide the inhabitants with modern homes as quickly as possible without population overspill. In the words of Councillor Eric Smythe, who was the 1960s Housing Committee Chairman at Enfield Borough Council in Outer London, and this isn't him in the picture, he said, quote, "Firstly, you had to create the holes to put up a tower block, which you did by pulling a couple of streets down. Then you put in the block, decanted the population, and commenced pulling down the rest of the area." Now, in the County of London, the LCC's claims to overall authority over public housing production were combined in the 50s and 60s by a very individualistic and, arguably somewhat self-indulgent design ethos within the architects department. Under the mid-50s regime of Chief Architect Leslie Martin, it was grandly assumed that the LCC had an example to set, whether in patronage of the arts or experimental construction, and cost and output efficiency seemed secondary. So, for example, young architect Martin Richardson, on joining the renowned architectural group headed by Colin Lucas in the LCC, he said, quote, "The whole of the housing division seemed like a giant nursery school whose main object was the happiness of architects. Nothing would make them use the same design twice, or worse, use someone else's design," unquote. This is a huge contrast to production and engineer-dominated cities like Glasgow. And unlike them, London was a hotbed of arty housing, an approach that was partly fed by celebrated and somewhat self-advertising avant-garde designers like the Smithsons and so on. But the leading role was played by the LCC as the pre-1965 upper-tier regional authority, which saw itself as a beacon of enlightened welfare provision, really rather national rather than local in status. The LCC designers played the lead role in the importation of the most popular type of high block in post-war England, which is the slender tower. And this was ultimately an import from Sweden, whose overall welfare state setup and architecture found strong admirers in Britain. The Swedes called this the Punkthus, which is translated into English as point block, and it went through many permutations, including in the 60s, the brutalist sculptural concrete LCC towers that were built at in Bermondsey at the Brandrams Works site. That's the bottom right one there, and also elsewhere. But the LCC was less prominent in the later, mainly 1960s turn in London, away from freestanding tower blocks to more densely conglomerated designs that was fueled by the propaganda for urbanity by international propagandists like Team 10 and the Smithsons. One of the most popular forms that this took was to have a continuous low-rise podium with towers sticking out of it, very much exemplified by the City of London's Barbican high rental scheme, with a kind of cluster of towers rising from a megastructural podium. But a later example was Kensington and Chelsea, as we'll see, the West Chelsea redevelopment, or World's End, designed and built from 1969 by Eric Lyons. And in fact, Lancaster Road West Phase 1 was also a miniature version of this in a sort of mini way. But all this diversity in the LCC-dominated system before 1964 was bought at the cost of much lower output than large cities like Glasgow or Salford. And the government's remedy to this London output crisis in 1964 to 5 was the rebalancing of the system in favor of the boroughs, and creating new, larger and more powerful boroughs. And this strategy resulted in a 55% jump in output per head of population between 1964 and 67. On the planning side, the tables now turned. The new London boroughs were virtually full planning authorities in the housing field. For the most ambitious of them, mass council housing was a means of creating civic identity, and an ethos boosted under the post-1964 Labour Harold Wilson government by the progress-chasing work of London Junior Housing Minister Robert Mellish. And he later recalled to me, quote, "I set up what was tantamount to a league table, and I said that the people at the bottom would be relegated." Within 5 years, a jumble of parochial towns and mini-towns and suburbs had become forceful city-like authorities, ostentatiously muscle-flexing within the council housing system to emphasize their emancipation from the LCC and to compete with each other. Some of them continued the LCC emphasis on architectural individualism, especially Lambeth, London Borough Council, whose leadership looked on housing design as a municipal flagship, and rather astutely got the prominent LCC architect Ted Hollenby in 1963 as their first borough architect, there on the left there. To raise output, Hollenby began in 1966 a program of 22-story tower blocks on small gap sites, designed in a rather individualistic way by his own architects, along with some low-rise projects. Others were also architecturally orientated, but in a different way, and especially in next door Southwark, which very proudly tried to sort of monumentalize its municipal social idealism. It built massive, horizontally accentuated complexes of deck blocks rather than towers, designed by the staff of borough architect Frank Hayes. The centerpiece of their program was the Aylesbury redevelopment, a typically London scattered assemblage of piecemeal slum-clearance sites dotted with numerous existing buildings, into which immensely long slab blocks and low terraces were threaded in 1967 to 75. In outer London boroughs, like, for example, Hounslow, in the middle and on the right there, where land wasn't in short supply, more conventional production orientated tower block schemes were built. In the case of Enfield, which is on the left there, these were mainly built by the borough's industrialized direct labor force called EDLO, which had worked out its own technique of prefabrication, which was used for a series of rather idiosyncratic checkerboard pattern towers all over Edmonton and Enfield in the late 60s. So let's now, we're moving on now. to the third part of the Matryoshka sequence, let's now go on to finish with something that contrasts with all of this by narrowing our focus still further onto Kensington and Chelsea. Now, this exemplified the extreme individualism of the post-1965 structure, not by its vigorous activity, like Southwark and so on, but by its inertia. It proved to be one of the weakest and least energetic house-building boroughs in terms of Bob Mellish's league table, certainly one of the candidates for relegation. Its slum clearance projects were relatively low-key, relatively scattered, as in the case of Lancaster Road West, including Grenfell Tower, and it still left the GLC to play a significant role. Now, a partial clue to the ineffectiveness of Kensington and Chelsea is given by its unique twin-headed name, which is apparently the result of the pressure on Sir Keith Joseph by kind of his neighbours. This was actually quite appropriate in the housing field because it actually symbolised two very different ways of approaching housing output and design. Now, before the 1964-5 amalgamation, both boroughs were Tory-controlled, but Bohemian Chelsea adopted a very strongly social ethos of housing provision. The council's resourceful housing committee chair, Alderman Elizabeth Stockwell, later recalled to me that, quote, "If you can imagine all those now expensive, endless streets in Chelsea, almost all without exception in the 40s were requisitioned housing. During the war, every time a house became empty, it got requisitioned, whole half streets at a time. The government suddenly said in the early 50s that it had to stop. And all of a sudden, these people needed to be rehoused, and we had to work out a way of doing it," unquote. So there was an eager willingness in Chelsea to experiment with high-density flats, and the borough embarked on a series of increasingly high-density flatted estates, starting off from the early post-war Cremorne Estate, which is on the right there, to the very controversial West Chelsea Extended Area, or the World's End project, an ultra-high-density scheme by architects Eric Lyons and Peter Cadbury Brown, which is intended to rehouse as much of Chelsea's slum population close at hand, and which was bitterly opposed by LCC planners, but successfully pushed through a complex public inquiry by Stockwell. Here are some images of World's End, only built, as I'll come on to in a second, under the new borough, rather reluctantly. So Kensington, pre-1965, pre-reorganisation Kensington, was very much more orthodox Tory in its politics, and under its 1960s leaders, Sir Malby Crofton and Anslow Wilson, it confined its housing activity to a rather unconventional niche policy, which was a stress on compulsory rehab. Especially in the slum areas of North Kensington. They did this by bearing down on recalcitrant landlords of dilapidated private housing and enforcing the repairs provisions of the Housing Act. This was unglamorous, but in fact quite effective in quantitative terms. But what went with this was an extreme reluctance to build council housing. And this was an ethos that extended over the whole new borough after 1965, because Kensington controlled the new post-1965 authority. It squeezed the Chelseaites out, and Kensington people held all the committee chairs. Rather like the old pre-1964 boroughs of the East End and Stepney and Poplar and so on, which had said, we won't do anything, we'll let the LCC do it, Kensington and Chelsea avoided building much council housing itself post-1965, although they had to go through with World's End, as Chelsea Borough Council had already signed all the contracts. They at first left the GLC to start building in North Kensington, and only intervened itself quite late, when the tide of opinion in London was already turning against high flats in the wake of the Ronan Point collapse in 1968. In the Housing Committee, which was chaired by Alderman C.A. Muller, Lancaster Road West was approved in principle as early as 1962, but it proceeded rather slowly. It was delayed by the London local government reorganisation, and it proceeded very much in parallel with a much larger World's End scheme. Stage 1, including Grenfell, was only finally approved in 1970, and then the medium-rise Stage 3 was approved 3 years later, by which time the whole scheme got embroiled in the contracting problems and building militants around 1970, which particularly hit World's End. And finally, the Lancaster Road West scheme was cut short in 1975 when the then Housing Minister Reg Friesen decided to stop high-density building altogether. Elizabeth Stockwell, former Chelsea Housing Chair, argued subsequently in 1987 that the rather scattered, disparate character of the Lancaster Road West redevelopment was a result of Kensington's lack of enthusiasm. She said, quote, "They just didn't do anything. They got chipped Mellish by Rachman, which is a bad landlord scandal. They got chivied into it by the deterioration of North Kensington in general. They eventually realized they had to do something about North Kensington, but they didn't do things in time," unquote. Now, that could, of course, be sour grapes from having all the Chelsea people being pushed out, but there it is. In terms of fragmentary character of Lancaster Road West Stage 1, and with its little kind of mini integrated commercial development and the relatively individualistic non-system built design of Grenfell Tower, which was by architect Clifford Weird and then the contractor, very traditional London contractor, A.E. Symes, in its original non-overclad form, you could argue, was very typical of the London tower block overall. Not system built, unlike Ronan Point, piecemeal and problematic, even if the overall scale of the development was actually at the lower end of the scale of production ambition. So to conclude, does the Russian doll the sequence we've gone through, the progressively narrowing focus I've set out on council housing in Britain, in London, and in Kensington and Chelsea, and then the resulting diversity of the micro worlds of housing policy and architecture, does this help in providing any kind of meaningful historical context for the Grenfell disaster? Well, I mean, rather than just simply saying no, I'd argue that certainly that if there are any lessons, they can only be rather oblique ones because of the radicalism of the policy reversal that developed in the wake of Thatcher and in the 80s onwards. Now, concerning council housing itself, one could plausibly argue that if the first very indirect lesson might be concerned with the politicized character that's intrinsic to council housing by comparison with arm's length programs elsewhere, as council housing was a part of government, local government, but a government all the same, and a direct participant in party political controversy, particularly in London, it proved only too easy for a hostile central government to pick it off, commodify it, and residualize it with Thatcher in the 80s and onwards. An interesting contrast from a kind of capitalistic place is the famous and now 85 years old NYCHA in New York City, a semi-municipal public authority that survived the collapse of the US public housing system virtually unscathed. Or there's the National Co-op Housing Organization in Sweden, the HSB, which is now nearly a century old, still going strong. There's a little bit of social democratic propaganda from earlier on in the century. In London, the two-tier system proved especially unstable and vulnerable to eventual decapitation. And the Tories eventually abolished the GLC altogether in the 1980s, while the relative autonomy of the new post-1965 boroughs left ample room for inertia in some cases, like Kensington and Chelsea, alongside frenzied activity in others. So whether any of this rather frenetic diversity and activity has any direct bearing on the long-term build-up to the Grenfell disaster itself, I would say all I could say is it's very much open to question. I think there are some suggestions, but certainly nothing direct. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Miles. That was an excellent overview. I don't know, you managed to cram so much in, quite honestly. It was full of information and full of ideas. It was a really good paper. Thank you for opening these sessions up in such a great way. Adrian, do we have any questions? I think we have one.
Yeah, we do. Thanks very much, Miles. Very good to be reminded of Bob Mellish And also in 30 minutes, you managed to cover both Reg Friesen and his eventual nemesis, Ken Livingstone. So for historians of post-war Labour politics, that was fascinating. I have a question here from Hayley Hayes, who says that she spent her early childhood living in a flat on the Chalkhill estate in Wembley, which she recalls as being very diverse and self-contained with a parade of shops, etc., but since been torn down and fairly notorious for crime. Do you believe that this kind of housing can work? And are there any examples of it working in the UK?
Well, obviously that's a very big question. I mean, if you're talking about Chalkhill, which is mainly deck access housing, or almost entirely deck access housing, that's popularly thought to be among the most problem-plagued, and because of the communication patterns and so on of mass housing estates. But I think it's salutary to remember that the Barbican is also a deck access housing, public housing estate, and I don't think anybody, it's not terribly dissimilar to Broadwater Farm, for example, in its layout with podiums and tall blocks coming out of it. I don't think anybody's suggesting that is whatever. So I think these are very oblique connection. And then in other countries, there's where there's a lot more slab blocks and not so many towers. Again, it's really more a matter of the political system, the management system. I'm not an architect. I don't have a sort of a brief to kind of like defend architects or anything like that. I personally think that the relationship between the built environment and management issues or whatever is a very, very indirect one in terms of general management issues. Obviously something like fire cladding, that's something totally different, but very specific. In terms of very high density, for example, in Hong Kong, the standard public housing towers being built now are 41 stories, 800 flats in each. They don't have the management problems that have sometimes been in Western countries, but
yeah.
Thank you, Miles.
Yes, thank you, Miles. Okay, that was I say, really interesting start and a really good way of opening today's seminar. So thank you very much for that, Miles. And obviously we'll come back, more questions at the end. We do have the Q&A section for questions. We were wondering whether that was entirely working. If there are any problems, if anybody's actually got any problems, you can flag them in the chat and we'll try and deal with them, okay? But otherwise, we'll try and go through the Q&A function. But if there are any problems, please flag them in the chat function. Okay, let's move on now. Next, I'd like to invite Dr. Eva Branscombe, who's from the Bartlett School at UCL. And Eva is going to be plotting the history of housing. It's really interesting the way the same space can become reinvented over different periods of time. So she's going to look at North Kensington, before Grenfell, North Kensington's slum and suburbs. Okay, Eva?
Yes, hi, thanks. Share my screen. Okay. So my paper is titled Before Grenfell, North Kensington Slums and Suburbs. My question is, how has architecture been involved in the spatial injustice of North Kensington? And how will we be able to use the memory of Grenfell to move beyond this in future? The story of North Kensington is one of inequality and has been so since the farmland was dug up to create this new part of London as genteel speculative housing for an aspirational Victorian middle class. My paper will engage with the historic context for the deeply ingrained disparity in the housing provision in this part of London that arguably resulted in the construction and eventual neglect of Grenfell Tower as part of the Lancaster West estate. The paradox of North Kensington is that from the very beginning, there was an intimately linked relationship between the newly developing suburb and the slumland with which it conjoined, as described by Jim Dias and David Reeder in their important essay. The term slum meaning here overcrowded living conditions within deteriorating housing stock no longer fit for human inhabitation. This is a story rooted in Victorian London, where the city of less than 1 million at the start of the century more than quadrupled within less than 100 years. But curiously, the story is not one of the poor following the more affluent. The land that eventually developed into North Kensington's first became inhabited as an urban overflow, as a displacement of the marginalized from the ever-growing city at the start of the 19th century. Samuel Lake was the first to move westward to the area called Nottingdale, to a site bordering on what is now Hammersmith, but was then still a bucolic landscape. Previous to this, he had operated a thriving business near Tottenham Court Road, running a gang of men clearing sewage receptacles, as well as children sweeping chimneys. Less than 2 decades later, the records show that pig keepers now also shared this site, as well as brickmakers. Building was rampant in London, and soon clay pits were dug up from the soil of this land, harvesting the bricks needed for the construction of the new neighborhood springing up just to the east. The clay fields were vast, some 16 acres, and soon the holes dug into the ground pooled with effluviant liquid from the runoffs of the piggeries and human excrement. Many of the people living there were not even residing in permanent shacks, as you can see on this slide, but in vans and converted railway carriages. Cholera broke out in 1849. The Ladbroke Estate on the northern side of Holland Park Avenue developed first, starting in 1820s. The housing was based on Nash's urban improvements at Regent's Park that had just been finished. It emulated the white stucco of the classical architecture, its terraces, as well as their urban forms of parkland and crescents, but all this was to be had at a budget price. So already from the very beginning, there was a great disparity in North Kensington between the very comfortably off and the desperately poor who lived in filth and ate what the grand houses were throwing away, sharing these scraps with their pigs. But the development of the area into middle-class housing progressed only sporadically. Where the land lay fallow between the elegant homes, other activities sprang up. There was for a while a hippodrome that opened in 1837 with a race course and viewing grandstand. There was a circus, donkey rides, balloon ascents, a boxing booth, fairgrounds, and more. The Norland Estate, forming the periphery of London's urban expansion, began to build up in the 1840s, slowly at first, and with an ambitious scheme for a royal crescent. By the 1870s, the piggeries had mostly disappeared, but the area then called Norland Town, to the north of the elegant houses on the Norland Estate, was still desperately impoverished. By the turn of the century, this even drew Octavia Hill's attention. The next section to develop from the 1850s onward were the St. Quintin and Portobello estates to the east. Around 1870, a market was started along Portobello Road, and the architectural historian Nicholas Pevsner later blamed it for the particular area's social decline. Indeed, the houses in Colville Gardens had been subdivided as early as 1881, but the problem had less to do with the market than with the overly grand speculative scheme as middle-class housing around Powys Square, for example. The substantial single-family homes with their stuccoed facades were 4 to 6 stories high. For many years, All Saints Church, Notting Hill, built from 1851 to 61, intended as the centerpiece of this development, stood unfurnished and without its windows, boarded up among the muddy wasteland. The oversized homes that were to eventually surround the church unfortunately fared no better. Once finished, they quickly became tenements, also because they were too remote compared to the other similar housing that was now in abundance. From the outset, there were problems with the residential development of North Kensington because the peripheries created by the self-enclosed urban planning determined by the land ownership and of the original estates. Acting as barriers, their inward-oriented street patterns blocked off communication between the individual tracts of land, as well as the respective new townships. North of the borough, industries had sprung up near the Paddington branch of the Grand Junction Canal that was being built from 1795 to 1801, and the Great Western Railway from 1832 to 1838. And so this site drew laborers who worked there. Many of these were Irish. But this tract of land was cut off from its environs by these two dominating infrastructures, as well as the village that developed there from 1835 to 1850 and became known as Kensal Newtown. Initially, the main industry there was laundry work, and pigs were also kept there. In 1903, Charles Booth noted this area for its squalor, even to surpass that of Notting Dale. By 1923, some 2,500 people occupied the houses of Southam Street, averaging 2 for each room. What needs to be understood here, however, within a more holistic context, are the various roles that the different inhabitants of this area fulfilled from the 1820s onwards, how they were linked and part of a kind of symbiotic process of urbanization. The histories of this intermingling are essential in understanding this part of London as a complicated palimpsest. In this sense, the slums that preceded the first new suburban houses were an important and even essential component of the city as a human process and enactment. They were an infrastructure to the growing city, just as essential as the canal and the cemetery, the roads and the sewers, and finally the railway lines that carved up Kensington on its northern periphery and separated it from the yet pastoral Hammersmith on the west. By the mid-1850s, casual labor and men working in building trade had settled in Norland Town and in close proximity to the multiple construction sites. Small laundries situated themselves among these workers' dwellings, mostly employing women who became the main and sometimes only bread earners, with their husbands often living off of their hard labor, letting their children run wild. There were various travelers' camps in Notting Dale, the one south of Latimer Road still existing today as a settlement just under the westway gyrating roundabout. The main encampment of some 40 to 50 families on the site of the former brickfield, just south of Lancaster West Estate's low-rise finger blocks, was near where St. Clement's Church still stands today. Most of the housing was completed by the 1870s, when the underground stations connected the area to central London, making this an easy commute. Here it is worthwhile to look at William Booth's map to see the unequal distribution of wealth in this area, and specifically the pockets of poverty. So this is the section of North Kensington, and here the red arrow shows Notting Dale, with the black indicating dire poverty. Then in Kensal Newtown, with blue, and finally in Portobello, with again the blue areas. While at the turn of the century, just one of the larger homes in Notting Hills could have easily employed up to 9 servants, during the Great Depression and the interwar years, this became too costly to maintain. These upper middle class families moved outwards into the newer suburbs, and empty properties were let out to poor flocking into the city, often as individual rooms to whole large families per one room. While the landlords still made money, they failed to invest in their crumbling building stock. Many of the large single-family homes of this area had become run down and were condemned for residency already in the early 1930s. But when World War II ended, Britain was financially ruined, and because of the housing shortage for many years, the rotten building stock continued to be used as multi-occupancy homes until the welfare state swept them away and replaced them by architectures that stood for a more socially minded future, promising an urban life that could be clean, private, and safe for everyone. The areas that became redeveloped in the 1960s as post-war slum clearance initiative were already 100 years earlier identifiable as pockets of poverty due to migration and urban displacement, as I've just explained. So first, Notting Dale, where the brickfields and piggeries had been. Then Kensal Newtown, where workers settled near the new industries alongside the canal and housing the navvies who were building the railways. And finally, the large houses of the Portobello in the Powers, Colville, and Stevens areas that were the result of over-speculation. After the war, these 3 sites were handled very differently. Urban renewal in North Kensington in the 1960s and 70s was radical, sweeping away older building stock and their communities and replacing them with new megastructures as large-scale housing estates. These included social facilities and were based on that idea of urban village, which is coincidentally coined by Elizabeth Denby, who helped build the housing estate, this early housing, Kensal House in North Kensington with Maxwell Fry. 28 acres of derelict housing stock were cleared away where Lancaster West Estate now stands, and you can see this on the arrow. Trellick Tower, located at the top of the site, hemmed in by the Grand Union Canal on the north and the Westway on the south, was designed by Ernest Goldfinger from 1986 to 72 as part of the Edenham Street redevelopment. The building rose 98 meters high, accommodating 217 dwellings across 31 floors. As part of an interconnected estate, the megastructure included a mid-rise housing block that faced the street, complete with shops and a doctor's surgery. Trellick Tower had a nursery at its base and community rooms, and faced onto a playground and basketball court on the south. A separate kind of village was located to the east of what was then called the Cheltenham Estate, and replaced parts of Kensal Newtown and the slum that had existed there since the 19th century. Trellick has become iconic on the skyline and was listed a Grade 2 star by Historic England in 1998. It has become heritage. The uncanny sculptural form of this tower stands apart from the ensemble of much simpler contemporary residential blocks close by on the other side of the Westway. The quartet of 20-story high-rise housing is part of the Silchester Estate, Frinstead House, Markland House, Dixon House, and Whitstable House. And the 23-story high Grenfell Tower, built on the opposite side of the train tracks as the point block of the Lancaster West Estate, designed from 1967 as part of an ambitious mixed-use urban redevelopment, and built from 1972 to 81 as mostly housing stock. So here you can see it under construction, and here you can see it complete. But not everyone was happy with the wholesale removal of the older housing stock, and here we return to the large crowded houses of the Powys, Colville, and St. Stephen's areas in Portobello. By the 1950s, they were run by the notorious slum landlords, who anyone desperate for housing, such as single mothers and prostitutes and those on the margins of societies. Here you can see some of the housing interior at St. Stephen's Gardens and what the street looked like on the outside. These houses also became the homes of the Windrush generation arriving in London, who struggled to find places to live upon their arrival. The UCL sociologist Ruth Glass studied this group of migrants in the late 1950s, apologies. And here you can see that some of the Rockman housing is also becomes the home for this group of migration. The resulting racial tensions were exacerbated by the dire housing shortage and led to the incendiary Notting Hill riots. But what came out of this was the Notting Hill Carnival as an attempt at intercultural understanding. The designation of Notting Hill as conservation area became a powerful mechanism to save these environments wholesale. And in 1969, 13 neighborhoods were protected from demolition in this way, including the Ladbroke Estate, Norland Estate, Pembridge Estate, as well as the housing in the problematic Portobello areas with its overcrowded housing. While the growing conservation movement made sure that the historic fabric was no longer being disposed of, this led to gentrification, and which was a new phenomenon coined and explained again by Ruth Glass in her seminal research on North Kensington. Artists and middle-class people soon moved into these streets, and the local authority quickly employed the planning device of the conservation area to disallow the use of buildings as nightclubs and discotheques, and started to change how the culturally diverse area was being used. Today, these homes are worth multiple millions. The disparity between those who had so little and those that had too much in North Kensington was from the outset fixed into the site and its location as a response to the growth of London. The need to be close to the center and the diverging opportunities for making money had always been equally important for both rich and poor. Today, the area remains polarized, but even before it burned, Grenfell Tower was in no way a slum. Many of the flats were privately rented and owned by young middle-class professionals, and one of its two-bedroom flats would today be worth more than £300,000. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eva. Thank you. That was excellent. Fantastic, fantastic slides, and it's really interesting to see and to plot how an area can be shaped and reshaped and defined and redefined through a complicated kind of intermingling of economic and political structures and policies. It kind of gives us an idea, therefore, how this long journey has resulted in the area kind of being structured as it is now. Adrian, do we have any questions?
Peter, we've got a couple of questions which are probably better dealt with, I think, in the general roundup at 13:50 rather than now, if that's all right.
Okay, then. In that case, thank you very much, Eva. We'll come back to you right at the end. That was really good. Thank you so much. Okay, now we are going to, I'm going to ask Dr. James Greenhalgh from the University of Lincoln to talk about tenants, constructing the unsuitable tenant. And this is about kind of ideas about how tenants have been perceived, marginalised and alienated across a long period of time. James.
Thanks, Peter. I'm just going to just actually turn my email address alerts off so they don't keep pinging at us. So I've called this Constructing the Unsuitable Tenant. You'll see perhaps why I sort of think that's the title's not quite right in a minute, but I'll get on with it. In the in the long aftermath of the Grenfell fire, and there's no slides, by the way, and the broad discourse focused on a number of interlocked issues. But as more information began to emerge about the fire, so a familiar aspect of the story became clear to historians of social housing, people like me. The residents had long concerned themselves that the tower was both neglected and unsafe, had organised themselves into an action group, and had submitted concerns about the quality and safety of the refurbishments to either silence, obfuscation, or even contemptuous dismissal. Moreover, it emerged that in July 2013, in response to the accusations that fire safety was being ignored, the council had threatened the group's blogger with legal action over defamatory behaviour. Now, what triggered this idea for this paper was hearing that from the outset, the inquiry was unlikely to tackle the wider issues in attitudes towards social housing and social housing tenants, despite a distinct feeling from many areas that the Grenfell Tower disaster was symptomatic of a failing in the edifice of social housing itself. So in essence, in this paper, I'm starting by taking a bit of a guess at what the third module of the second phase of the inquiry will find. That is the part of the inquiry that tackles the management of the tower and the communication with tenants over their concerns. So I guess what we'll see, and only time will tell if I'm correct, is repeated attempts by tenants to bring up serious issues that were either dismissed, responded to negatively, or rejected as either inaccurate or perhaps too expensive, or indeed unrealistic. That the overall tone of the interactions will be of casting the tenants as either troublesome, overly demanding, or inexpert in their views. This paper is an attempt to point towards some of the mechanics of where this attitude comes from, of early histories that embedded within local government the idea of what I called in the introduction the unsuitable tenant, but what we might also perhaps more accurately call the ungrateful or even the unmanageable tenant. And I'm going to found this by talking about an earlier period than Miles did before, focusing on a comparison between the ambitions of social housing, largely in cottage housing estates rather than tower blocks, and what happened during the first decades of social housing's real existence, largely between the 30s and the mid-50s. Now, it's not an attempt to dismiss the work of people like Ann Power, etc., that they've done in showing how in the later part of the 20th century, social housing became stigmatized as undesirable housing through combinations of neglect, poor design principles, lack of investment, lots of the stuff that Miles was just alluding to. Rather, what I'm going to do is make an attempt to look at the foundations of a general discourse surrounding housing and tenants from an earlier period that feeds into what I think happens later. And then I'm hoping actually that Alan's paper is going to sort of back to back with this afterwards. Now, to understand this process, we have to think about the purpose of social housing and consider what the parameters of failure are. The facts are that in the beginning with emblematic examples like places like Becontree, Wythenshawe in Manchester, the British state built housing that meant by 1961, for example, about 13 million people lived in homes rented from the state. Now, I've never been able personally to see this as a failure, either from the point of view of the state's original intentions, which to me were largely about health and shelter and hot water and not going to the toilet outside, nor from the point of view of tenants who saw council housing in a positive light, a force for social mobility, etc. However, what I want to think about is the goals that almost immediately became attached to these ideas by corporations and planners, which were in themselves behavioural and social in nature. So the new estates of the interim post-war came with some very specific ambitions on behalf of planners and local authorities. Social housing, initially planned as a combination of garden city and American neighbourhood principles in a broad sense, sought to produce distinctly positive outcomes through a combination of three things. First, stringent governance and rules. Second, the creation of a diverse community. And thirdly, the supposed benefits that certain material spaces would bring to the inhabitants themselves, almost through a sort of spatially deterministic process. Put people in good environments and they'll behave well. So planners like Manchester's Roland Nicholas extolled the virtues of English community spirit as engendered through the arrangement of village-like greens, garden clubs and pleasant streets, whilst the National Council of Social Services, Ernest Baker, believed that the provision of community and educational facilities might produce, quote, something like Athens in the grand days. In Manchester and Hull's new estates, which is two of the cities I know most about, as elsewhere, greenery, communal facilities and pleasant environments were lauded not merely for health benefits, but for their ability to create citizens who were more civic-minded, democratic, a word used a lot, and happier. Indeed, this ideal type of citizen wasn't merely to be produced on estates themselves. The new homes were initially designed to be only for the quote-unquote best type of tenants, an indication that inhabitants were meant to, from the start, be both of a desirable type, but also inculcating at the inception of mass social housing, the notion that it was for those who knew how to behave properly. From the emblematic estates at Wythenshawe to the smaller examples I've studied in Hull and Lincoln and Rotherham, rents of between 12 and 16 shillings throughout the 1930s placed council houses just within the reach of only skilled workers. Moreover, a highly judgmental housing list system and a demand for retail and hospitality sites that before the war consistently outstripped available locations were combined with a keen sense of just exactly what constitutes, quote again, the right type of person, into a system that meant new corporation estates remained relatively exclusive, definitely aspirational, and admitted only a very narrow type of individual. So there was a distinct belief that through putting the right people, again, in the right environment, planners and local authorities could produce tenants and communities who were dignified, law-abiding, largely homogenous, not overly political active, and treated their new homes and neighbourhoods with respect. However, this did not translate to a trust that the working classes could be relied upon to form the right type of community and political associations themselves, even from Labour-dominated corporations like the Manchester Corporation. So in 1950, Manchester was growing concerned. So after about sort of nearly 20 years of the existence of parts of the Wythenshawe estate, which was still being built, they were growing concerned about the failure of Wythenshawe to attract a diverse mix of peoples to it. And I'm going to quote at length here, so apologies. They said, "It has been generally accepted as an essential part of neighbourhood development that all classes of society should be represented. It would seem apparent that the functioning of a centralised neighbourhood community will largely depend on their living in the neighbourhood a good mixture of social spheres, and in particular those people who are mentally suited to exert leadership. It seems essential to the development of the democratic way of living that those who have not a natural aptitude for creative thinking should be brought into contact with those who have. The alternative is the completion of Wythenshawe wholly in the form of corporation houses, building a town without the professional, commercial and industrial supervisory personnel, essential to the prosperity of the town as well as the development of its social traditions. It would be a social disaster if a town of some 90,000 people were not to contain all the spheres of society which go into making a free people." Now, for those of us who know the direction of travel in Wythenshawe and other large estates, the fears of the council, if you like, were largely realised. Though in some ways class mixing is a laudable aim, it reveals here a more sinister side, a real class-based prejudice for opinions, traditions, and ideas of working classes were not suitable without leadership from the upper working and middle classes. It's perhaps unsurprising then that throughout the post-war, the same corporation dismissed a lot of, or lost, patience with residents who sought to politically organise themselves, bearing in mind how little they thought of the ability of the working classes in general to do this. In Manchester, the Wythenshawe Estate Committee constantly, so a citizens committee, constantly levelled criticism at the way local volunteers ran community facilities, overriding their decisions. This lack of patience was also apparent in the dealings with community advocacy groups. So whilst the Manchester Corporation lauded certain wholesome activities like parades, Rose Queen festivities, etc., they were less pleased with the organised criticism from the Wythenshawe Community Council, a citizens group, and their energetic chairman, Harry Lloyd, who constantly harangued the local corporation for failing to finish communal facilities and shops. Despite admitting to their own failure in providing the facilities, the Manchester City Corporation continually refused to meet with the residents in public forums, occasionally dispatching the clerk to listen to their concerns and privately disparaging the organisations and its leaders as troublesome or unable to understand the realities of post-war finance. Now, the notion that these inhabitants from these estates were not to be trusted to shape their own organisations was also extended to the material environment. In the immediate term, this meant, for example, almost all corporation landlords producing stringent sets of standards for their tenants, usually in printed handbooks or on the back of rent books, of which I've managed to collect about 20 so far, and I think lots of you might be familiar with these. These standards often included a prohibition against all sorts of things. For example, untidy lawns and gardens, the planting of certain types or heights of trees, prohibitions against erecting or changing fences, a warning against certain types of curtains, colours of paint, and alterations to the houses themselves, all of which could get you fined or evicted. Local corporations would only allow certain types of associations and activities depending on how they saw the function of communal space as well. So, for example, gardening clubs or the aforementioned Rose Queen festivals, civic pride committees were distinctly encouraged across the board. Yet on many estates, community centres were banned from selling alcohol, whilst on others there was prohibitions about them for using community facilities for political or religious gatherings, which in turn caused conflict repeatedly in the records of local corporations with local groups, Baptists and Labour parties and things like that. The fear then that contentious ideas of working class politics or of diverse confessional issues would split community coherence and destroy neighbourhood solidarity was placed over some very simple practical ideas about people being able to use their community spaces for what they saw fit. Now, moreover, these rigid, often quite nebulous ideas, and this is the key thing, this nebulousness of what constituted acceptable use of certain spaces was extended to all the spaces, all the material areas of these new estates, particularly green spaces and even undeveloped areas. And it's important to understand, I think, just for a second, just how much planners and local corporations bought into the idea that well-designed estates were intrinsically deterministic of positive behaviours. Because this meant that when people use what were frankly totally spare, useless bits of land, the corporation often became furious. In Wythenshawe, for example, throughout the 30s and 40s, the estate committee was constantly irritated by multiple facets of what I think we should consider the very ordinary activities of residents' daily lives. Shortcuts, for example, damaged grass swards, people collected branches from trees for firewood, residents adopted grass verges adjacent to their houses to grow vegetables, and little girls picked flowering plants while their brothers played football in common areas. I can't go into these detail about these incidents, but I've written about them at length in the 4th chapter of my last book. Nevertheless, the significance of these incidents is that in response, the corporation, instead of viewing these as the place-making activities of people making new homes and neighbourhoods, reacted angrily or with frustration, acting in ways that cast the completely normal actions of inhabitants as disruptive, abnormal, and often criminal. So, for example, four-man patrols were eventually mounted to catch people taking branches and flowers. Young children were fined and even on several occasions hauled away by police for relatively minor transgressions of indistinct boundaries. Signs prohibiting everything from ball games, which we can all remember from being kids, to crossing roads at certain points were erected, whilst ever more impenetrable hedges and thorny hedges and fences were dreamed up to stop routes through fields and roads that the council deemed contrary to the never obvious objectives of the designers, and thus contrary to good behaviour. Now, in many ways, I think we have to understand some of this as corporations becoming landlords and encountering the problems of being landlords for the first time. And yet they were trying to impose rules that simply did not exist either in working class areas or on private estates. Nevertheless, their reaction was not to accept the assumptions about life should function was simply incorrect, but instead to cast their tenants as troublesome and pursue ever more stringent and punitive actions, to dismiss their concerns or to cast them as an unnecessary nuisance. The planning records of Hull and Manchester and many other cities in the immediate post-war show that even when tenants submitted formal planning applications to erect things like fences, garages, or porches, they were almost always rejected because they disrupted the uniformity and general design principles of the estates, with one councillor commenting on an application to erect a garage in 1955 in Hull that he could not see why anyone could afford a car should be deserving of a council house. In Manchester in the same period, a rejection to install a wicket gate in an existing hedge bears the judgment that allowing such a thing might start a trend that would lead to an avalanche of similar requests, disruptive to the communal life and atmosphere of the estate. So I know this has been a kind of whirlwind tour of this period, and I've just touched on things here and there, but what I've tried to show is how, because of, as I said, what in my judgment are unrealistic and rather nebulous notions of social improvement and community creation that corporations and planners attach to early council estates. The issues when these rules, rules of space, these complaints were rendered, they combined into a discourse that began to regard the actions, activities, and opinions as tenants as inherently troublesome, undesirable, or incorrect, forming an idea of the tenant that has been built on through the types of processes described by Miles, some of the stuff that I think we'll probably see in Alan's paper to precede that, and also through work on the 70s and 80s and 90s by other historians and sociologists. Corporations definitely started with good intentions, and social housing in a material sense can never, I want to stress this in my mind, be seen as a failure because of the material of social housing, especially in these early periods, but a combination of innate prejudices, the natural behaviours and desires of inhabitants, and the failure to produce cross-class mixing meant that corporation and planners were swiftly disabused of the notion that the estates could spatialise a type of community and society through careful planning and control. In the short term, the evidence shows that corporations of the late 1950s began to abandon their strict rules on decoration and additions to housing and became less stringent on the use of local land. I think, and I've argued this out elsewhere, realising to some degree that their lofty goals were in fact futile and perhaps even misguided. And of course, they just replaced them with a set of different goals and ideas and you know, thought that perhaps they'd not done it right. I think then what I'm trying to show you is that right at the inception of social housing, there began a long process that combined with, of course, practical things like financial difficulties into what we might call neglect, that reflected the view that projects like Wythenshawe or the North Hull Estate or many other places had not only not delivered, but had brought to light a class of unmanageable tenants and placed them directly within the responsibility of local authorities who did not know or did not want to deal with them. Thanks very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much, James. Obviously, a lot of that resonates with some of my own stuff.
Absolutely.
I think there are things like the use of language is really important, certain terminology used. And of course, you are talking about attempts to help and support a kind of more affluent working class and a lower middle class. And those attempts are very genuine. But of course, that then always left the issue of the slum dweller, and the slum dweller lies beneath, and the slum dweller is an even bigger problem, and how do we control that? And of course, all that starts to unravel because of the pressures after the war, doesn't it?
Absolutely, yeah.
Thank you very much, James. There's some great points in there. Adrian.
Yeah, so we've got a comment in the chat. Perhaps James would like to comment on. Mark Stevens says that he recalls looking through tenancy files in Islington and finding letters from tenants requesting permission to have a telephone in the 60s and 70s. And just wondering, is that a sort of typical paternalism that one found in that period, and how does that fit into your argument, James?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely spot on. One of the things I actually cut out of this just for time was that indeed in Manchester, in Hull, in Lincoln, three of the places I'm really familiar with, telephones are really objected to. Another one is television aerials. They're really not keen on people having television aerials. And I think there's a combination of two things here. I think, first of all, there's this paternalism, and it's about uniformity of space, and it's about, the sort of in the council house, we provided you with what you need. Why do you need more? But also there's this idea that somehow, if you're deserving, especially as time goes on, if you're deserving of the support effectively of renting from the council, whether you should be allowed to enjoy luxuries that people who don't have. And I think we've got some other papers later on, maybe not today, but further on in this series, where people are going to talk a bit about design and the way that houses and flats come to look. And if you look at really recently built council housing, you've got a lot of little tiny windows and things like that. Now that's viewed as being, that's pitched as the idea about making them efficient and things like that. But there's also a distinct streak of saying council houses must look like council houses. They cannot be as good as private homes. Otherwise, why would people in private homes want private homes? So yeah, absolutely. The telephone thing is spot on, I'd say. Yeah.
That opens up another kind of worms around what is the role of the council house. Should it be temporary, or should it motivate for the more aspirational working class who want to own their own homes? Right, we could go on, James. We could go on. Thank you very much. That was excellent again. Really good. Thank you. So next, from Bangor University, I've known him many years, we have Alan Ephram. And Alan's going to give us a kind of an overview of housing policies and how those housing policies in the post-war period led to a kind of marginalisation. They underpinned this process of marginalisation in post-war Britain. Alan.
Okay. Can everyone hear me? Excellent. Okay. So I'll start now then. So contemporary British social housing estates, from large tower blocks in inner cities to small rows of cottages and agricultural villages, are spaces of extreme social segregation. This fact rightly dominates all serious discussion of the disaster at Grenfell Tower. Indeed, this fact dominates most serious discussion of social housing in Britain today. We take it as read that it primarily exists as a service for the poor and socially marginalised, and ground our arguments in this fact. Yet it was not always so. Council housing was conceived as a means of correcting market failure, as a means of providing quality housing to families who could not afford to buy their own homes, not at providing a minimum standard of accommodation for the poor. During the interwar period, the intended beneficiaries of what was then a new policy were skilled workers and their families. By the immediate post-war period, the class element had vanished entirely, and the emphasis, in a time of significant housing shortages, was on the provision of housing to young families of whatever social background. Council housing was defined as a form of universal mass housing, and the planning of council estates was dominated by the concept of the mixed community, in which people of all occupations would live happily together in a spirit of social harmony. The Conservative government elected at the end of 1951 was to agonise over housing policy to an extent not seen before or since. At the heart of its troubles were two contradictory impulses. The first was the electoral need to oversee the construction of as many houses as possible, enough to end the post-war housing shortages they had cleverly, if not particularly honestly, ascribed to the inefficiencies inherent to the Labour government's socialist agenda. The second was the unpalatable reality that this would not be possible without an intensification of council house construction. The private house building industry was at a historically low ebb, and while efforts to revive it were planned and would prove to be highly successful, it would inevitably take time before it could realistically provide sufficient houses to come even close to meeting the scale of demand. A third issue, marginal at first but soon to prove highly significant, was the political consensus on the issue of slum clearance. Once that long-delayed problem was finally tackled in a serious manner, there will be a need to rehouse a significant number of people. With no extra capacity in the housing market whatsoever, this would inevitably mean the construction of even more council houses. A compromise was found. At first, to simultaneously encourage a great increase in council house construction and a resurgence in commercial house building, and then, once the back of the post-war housing shortage had been broken, to eliminate housing subsidies for general needs. Moreover, it was decided to use the housing finance framework to encourage local authorities to rehouse former slum residents, where possible, in blocks of flats rather than in conventional houses. These changes were the first step in the transformation of British social housing estates, but they were only a first step. They did not affect existing estates, and the new association between council housing and the slum districts was at this stage still something that existed more in the minds of policymakers and the general public. As is often the way, the following step occurred due to the failure of this compromise. The abolition of the general needs subsidies had, as anticipated, caused a collapse in council house construction. Unfortunately, the increase in private sector house building had not been rapid enough to make up the shortfall. As the housing shortage began to grow, as did its electoral salience. A further reform of the housing finance system followed in 1961. A rather tortured set of changes designed to strike a balance between the system as it existed before and after the alterations of the middle 50s. Significantly, the new system maintained the bias towards high-rise construction, and the approximate equivalent of the old general needs subsidy, I can only say approximate as the new system was excessively complex, was significantly lower than what had existed before the mid. The political problem that housing continued to pose to Conservatives. In the end, the minister tasked with finding a way out, Joseph, appointed as housing minister following the Night of Long Knives in 1962. Even then, he was a figure firmly on the right wing of the party, but one who embraced, as so many backbenchers did not, the possibility that technocratic modernism might function as an efficient bulwark against socialism, that the interests of property and free enterprise could best be defended through the efficient and controlled use of state power for the general good. Joseph's stated aim was to increase the number of houses built by local authorities without challenging the preeminence of private provision, established only so recently and of great importance to him both politically and personally. His father had founded the house building firm Bovis. But he also had another goal in mind. Defending his policies to a group of suspicious backbenchers in 1963, Joseph informed them that everything he was doing as housing minister was geared towards securing a stable future in which private enterprise would be able to reassert its rightful place as the principal provider of new housing, even in the rental market. This, he explained, would take time and would require significant changes to the political climate, changes that would not occur as long as there was significant housing shortage and as long as the slums remained standing. In practice, Joseph's legacy as housing minister was his enthusiastic promotion of system-built high-rise tower blocks, the idea of which he and his department's permanent secretary, Dame Evelyn Sharp, sold to council leaderships up and down the country as a rational and scientific solution to the otherwise intractable problem of slum clearance and redevelopment. This has often been regarded as a curious thing to have happened, as an action that ran quite contrary to Joseph's ideological motivations in the general course of his career. But when placed in the proper context of his broader housing policy strategy, a different picture emerges. By pushing local authorities towards building system-built higher-rises, and by encouraging them to link this to an acceleration of their slum clearance programs at the same time as he attempted to inflate the private housing market and commercial house building industry, Joseph was engaged in a conscious attempt to change the nature and purpose of public housing in Britain, to move it further away from the post-war vision of universal mass housing and the mixed community council estate. When Labour regained office in 1964, it made no attempt to reverse this policy agenda and actually greatly intensified it. This was for purely practical reasons. Wilson and Crosman certainly did not share Joseph's priorities and long-term vision. But where housing is concerned, what matters is ends and not intentions, and a new consensus on the purpose of council housing had decisively emerged. In essence, it was now seen as a form of housing for people who could not afford to be aspirational. It cannot go ignored here that this new consensus went hand in hand with a marked decline in the quality of both the planning and construction of new council estates in most large local authorities. The new consensus was reinforced by a parallel process that by contrast was highly contentious: the decline of the low-rent private sector accommodation, the main form of tenure for the urban poor until well into the 1960s. It is important to understand that there were in effect two low-rent private sector housing markets in mid-20th century Britain rather than one. The first was that which covered the old slum districts, and despite considerable unhappiness amongst elements in the conservative grassroots, there was a widespread consensus across the political divide in favour of the compulsory purchase and demolition of these properties. The second was dominated by late 19th and early 20th century housing, usually by law terraces, but also tenement blocks and large houses subdivided into flats. This was a market characterised by transience and short tenures. It rapidly became associated with post-war migration. The fate of the second form of low-rent private sector accommodation was one of the most fiercely contested of all housing policy questions during the period, where Labour saw landlordism and exploitation, and as many of these low rents were not particularly low, at least for not what the tenants actually received, advocated rent controls, regulation, and tenant protections. Conservatives were apt to see the erosion of private property rights by the overmighty state and favoured a lighter touch. What made the politics of the issue so inflammatory was that in certain parts of the country, most notably in inner West London, a firm distinction between the two loose types of low-rent private accommodation did not exist. The widespread exposure of this fact in the early 60s pushed popular opinion towards Labour's position and was the cause of much of the difficult climate noted by Joseph. Rent control and firm government regulation of the sector returned in 1965, but even before then, councils had begun to experiment with measures designed to restrict this part of the private rental market. In some cities, notably Birmingham, this took on a racialised aspect, with the conversion of properties into HMOs permitted in select immigrant districts and prohibited elsewhere, resulting in an intensification of residential ethnic segregation. In many London boroughs, slum clearance policies were expanded to include borderline streets and districts, and large numbers of private rental properties were subject to compulsory purchase. Many were demolished. The upshot of this was a significant movement of poor and socially marginal households from private rental accommodation into council housing, and in particular into high-rise council housing, the main form being constructed in cities and boroughs where this was an issue. All of this takes us to 1979 and to the radical housing reforms of the Thatcher government. The state-subsidised right of council tenants to buy their houses at below market price, the nationally mandated shift towards a needs-based point system as the only means of allocating council housing, and the near-complete deregulation of the private rental sector. While these reforms are usually thought of as representing a major break with half a century of housing policy, they were in fact its entirely logical culmination. The council house envisioned first as a respectable home for respectable working families, and then as a universal solution to universal housing problems, became permanently and irrevocably established as the home of the poor, the dream of the mixed community council estate replaced by the new nightmare of the problem estate, a place not of communal warmth but of atomized despair, a symbol of the state's inherent inability to tackle systemic social problems. The developments that I have charted were not the result of a single conscious plan, even though one can certainly draw a direct line between the thought and actions of Keith Joseph in the early 60s and Margaret Thatcher 20 years later, yet nevertheless followed a consistent, relentless logic, step following step in a classic pattern of path dependency. Ultimately, what changed was the status of the council tenant. During the first few decades of council housing, council tenancy was primarily understood in terms of citizenship. The council tenant was provided with housing by the state because access to a certain standard of housing had become viewed as a right of citizenship. If the Englishman could not afford his castle, then it was the duty of the state to provide him with at least a modest Motte Bailey. But as council housing acquired a wider policy purpose, as it began to be used to tackle not just the consequences of market failure, but also long-standing social problems, and also as access to home ownership widened, this changed. Council tenancy came to be understood as a form of state charity rather than as a right of citizenship. the council tenant was no longer first and foremost a citizen, but a state dependent with little agency. What is the use of history in the comprehension of contemporary tragedy? Certainly, it cannot explain individual errors and failures, and it cannot point directly towards the avoidance of their repetition elsewhere. It can definitely offer no solace. Yet it has a clear role to examine the long-term factors that paved the way to disaster. Because while it would be absurd to claim that the tragedy at Grenfell Tower can be directly pinned on the historical processes described in this paper, I do not think it would be especially controversial to suggest that the disaster could not have occurred without it, as the marginal status of the social tenant and their established social position as state dependents, without agency even in the maintenance of their own homes, even in their concerns about their own safety, rather than as equal and respected citizens, played an immense and baleful role at Grenfell Tower. I would further add that as this is an issue of relevance to every single social housing estate in the United Kingdom, large and small, attempts to prevent similar disasters occurring in the future must begin with an understanding of this historical background, must attempt to comprehend the extent to which it has often warped decision-making at a local and even housing management level, and must continue to accept that for all the fine words from public bodies we have seen post-Grenfell, it continues to have the potential to do so.
Very good, Alan. Thank you very much. And you were on time as well. That's the first time ever. There's some really good points in there, Alan. Has anybody got any questions before we break? Adrian?
Well, again, there are a few general points that have come up, Peter. But perhaps they're best dealt with.
That's absolutely fine. I think the main issue here, Alan, is of course the way council tenants become stereotyped, become stigmatized, they become marginalized, as you point out, and then there's a sense of alienation that grows and grows.
They become people that the state, the council and the state does things to, rather than people who have a say in what happens to them.
Yes, you're not in the private market. You're not able to compete for a house, as I've said several times. Even somebody who's trying to buy a modest terrace house still has some say and some control over that process. Yeah. But when you are a dependent of the state, then that kind of, you're a second-class citizen, and that kind of builds on what James is saying. And you can almost see these attitudes coming from the 19th century, the housing charities of the 19th century, from people like Octavia Hill. It kind of builds and builds, and then as you both touched on race. In fact, we all touched on race. Race is a multiplier. So we have one level, we have poverty, we have the poor, we have the underclass pushed to the sides, and then from the 50s, 60s onwards, race kind of acts as a multiplier of all the problems that are already being faced by the poor in the housing market. Okay, thank you very much for that, Alan, and thank you everyone. I thought that was an excellent start. I think we break for lunch now, and then we're still on course to come back for, is it 10 past 1?
10 past 1, yeah. Yeah,
10 past 1. So we'll see you all again. Have a nice lunch, and we'll see you all again at 10 past 1. Thank you, because Shad looks very nervous. Are we ready?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Sorry. Now we know them. I've got millions of messages. Right, there we go. Okay, welcome back, everyone. Everybody that goes to the conferences and academic conferences, lunchtime is always a really important period, but I have to say that the lunch today wasn't up to the usual standard. Never mind. So I'd like to start this afternoon's session by inviting Shada Rosina from Leicester University, and she's going to be talking about private landlords, private landlord exploitation, Rackman, and of course the impact of gentrification. And the title is Gentrification and the Significance of Racial and Class Inequalities in Kensington on the Grenfell Tower Tragedy. Shada.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my PowerPoint. Give me one moment. right. Oh, one minute. Can everyone see that? All good, perfect. Okay. So yeah, this is quite a momentous topic, but I'm going to try and put it in 15 to 20 minutes, hopefully. I'm a geographer at the doing a PhD at the University of Leicester, and I'm also a lifelong resident of Kensington. So I am writing about my own experiences as well as those of my neighbours and my friends. I'm going to start here with Ruth Glass, a Jewish German-born sociologist who studied in London before the Second World War. Studied in London before the Second World War. Then she came to live in the UK from 1943, where she spent her life working on town planning. Glass first coined the term gentrification in 1964 when describing the movement of the middle classes into working class areas in London. This process led to the displacement of the existing community and the transformation of the socio-cultural character of the neighbourhood. A lot of geographers have focused solely on this definition without looking at Glass's slightly later research into housing and population in North Kensington in the mid-1960s, where she exposed not only the gentrification of the borough, with erratic rents driving out the community, but she also showed how poor and minority ethnic residents suffered at the hands of corrupt landlords. Through interviews of residents, Glass found a complex web of social groups in North Kensington. Yet when it came to housing, it was, as Glass writes, the newcomers that had to pay higher rents for inferior accommodation. By newcomers, Glass wrote that the population was made up of a considerable number of internal migrants and 20% of immigrants from abroad, most of whom were either Irish or from the West Indies. The lower income groups Glass described as being the native Londoners, the Irish, and then the West Indians. These groups were more likely to pay extortionate rents for inferior, often unsanitary accommodation. Glass also stated that rents were determined by the date of a tenant's arrival at the landlord's doorstep, his origin, and his colour. On top of this, there was a newcomer's tax and a foreigner's levy that was especially high for those who were not white. Glass was among one of the first researchers to use both statistics and interviews to reveal the racial and class inequalities that existed within the early gentrification of North Kensington. Just like today, Glass recorded how the poorest are wedged in between the wealthiest, leading to competition for space, and as the wealthier residents come to live in the north of the borough, the lower classes were displaced. In Glass's own words, a home is run down and packed with people so long as this is profitable, and then sold at a high price for the purpose of gentrification. The methods used in this gentrification in North Kensington were encapsulated by landlord Peter Rackman. Rackman began his property empire in North Kensington from 1957, where he bought old rundown houses, removed the sitting tenants, and then rented the property at extortionate rents. Rackman's horrendous treatment of poor working class tenants, the majority being from the West Indian population, was coined as Rackmanism. Today it is defined as the exploitation and intimidation of tenants by dishonest and corrupt landlords. This treatment included offering small amounts of money to bribe tenants to leave, making their lives intolerable by playing music all night, organising parties to take place next door, cutting off electricity and water, or breaking locks and toilets. New tenants were usually immigrant families who were seeking housing security, so Rackman exploited these groups by demanding high rents for a home. There are similarities with the way that tenants are treated today. Loretta Lee stated that the council had become London's new Rackman in the context of the Aylesbury estate, where methods used to remove tenants included turning off electricity and gas, preventing mail deliveries, and then physically carrying out the last resident from their home. These tactics resulted in anxiety, depression, and eventually physical displacement. Some aspects of Rackmanism also constitute a slow violence on behalf of the landlord, council, or property manager. And in many ways, a slow violence through state Rackmanism is a term that can be used to describe the treatment of Grenfell residents at the hands of the KCTMO, the Kensington and Chelsea Tenant Management Organisation, when the needs and concerns of residents were completely neglected. So slow violence is often used as a tool of gentrification. It can be defined as a threat or harassment by landlords, councils, property management companies, which then puts displacement pressures on low-income residents and eventually removes these residents from their home. Instead, the gentrifiers, which today include the super rich, the elite, the investors, the land bankers, are considered a more attractive prospect for the area. Nixon describes slow violence as a violence that is neither spectacular nor instantaneous, but rather incremental and accretive, its calamitous repercussions playing out across a range of temporal scales. Leslie Kern also looks specifically at slow violence and gentrification and describes it as the non-events, such as the new coffee shop or the removal of a favourite bench, that contributes to a loss of familiarity and community. Slow violence is also represented in the continued neglect of tenants over a significant amount of time, and the emotional, psychological, and material effect this has on residents experiencing gentrification. The Grenfell Action Group, a group made up of residents from the Tower, published blogs online about the failures of the KCTMO, including the complete neglect over their concerns on fire safety in the building. Shocking to read, but incredibly important, is a blog post on November the 20th, 2016, Playing with Fire, in which residents state that only a catastrophic event will expose the ineptitude and incompetence of our landlord, the KCTMO, and bring an end to the dangerous living conditions and neglect of health and safety legislations that they inflict upon their tenants and leaseholders. There are also letters written to the Kensington Fire Brigade and the council about residents' fears that Grenfell Tower was no longer fireproof after the refurbishment of the building, which included narrow passageways and a fire door that had been sealed up. Reading the Grenfell Action blogs online exposes the slow violence, but do also take a look at the documentary play Dictating to the Estate. The play was created by Kensington residents and is compiled entirely of emails, blogs and council minutes from before the fire and during the inquiry as well. The documentary makers are in the process of putting on a full production. Is really important, so do have a look, and there's the link and Twitter handle on the slide there. This ongoing neglect of safety is also evidenced in residents' everyday experiences of living on the Lancaster West Estate. What I found particularly haunting when interviewing two different residents of the estate is that they both separately mentioned that fire brigades and or fires were a fairly normal occurrence. The first of these residents, a friend of mine who lived on the estate for 20 years with his family, he told me there were always fire brigades. It was no surprise to see the lights from the fire brigade outside your house. It seemed like there was always an incident. You couldn't tell because Grenfell Road was the main road in, a single road, so it could be in the service of people on our estate or for the tower or any of the walkways, but it was a regular occurrence. When talking about Grenfell Tower, a female resident on the same walkway who still lives on the estate stated, "I don't know if you know this, but there was always fires in that building. It was so common before the cladding because the cladding was very recent. There used to be constantly fires there. Outside Green Pitch, we would see on the first floor, like one of the floors is on fire and you had to get fire trucks in and stuff like that. It was really common." Residents describing the presence of fire brigades or even fires as being a common occurrence, alongside the safety concerns that were exposed in the letters, emails and blogs by residents on the estate, exposes this neglect and the complete lack of care and support for residents by the KCTMO. And I argue that this constitutes a slow violence, used in gentrification to create anxiety among residents and to ultimately remove those not regarded as economically or socially desirable. Gentrification in Kensington today, much like the rest of London and other big cities, has involved the emergence of the super rich and the investors and corporations who occupy and own multitudes of housing, often for the purpose of land banking or buy-to-let, such as Airbnb. And many of the super rich own homes adjacent to or very near Grenfell Tower, including the mansions around Holland Park or the new built luxury complexes on Kensington High Street. A key reason for the Grenfell fire spreading so rapidly was the aluminium and plastic cladding that was fitted on the exterior facade, a cladding that failed to meet the safety standards set out by its own manufacturer, Arconic. The external cladding was supposedly fitted to improve the thermal performance of the building, but when decisions were made, a cheaper cladding was chosen and installed. Many residents in Kensington, myself included, believe that this cladding was also fitted to beautify the building and to make it fit in with its richer surroundings. A few of my participants described how Grenfell Tower before the cladding had looked strong and that people on the estate were not complaining that it was ugly. The building's functional before the cladding, and that was what mattered. In fact, Grenfell was designed with extra strength in mind after the Ronan Point tragedy in 1968. So the tower was built with external concrete columns and an outdoor fire staircase towards the bottom of the building. The decision to install a cheaper cladding, which was agreed by the Tory-led council, was a way of gentrifying the area, making North Kensington look more attractive in order to appeal to the super rich and the investors, which in consequence would put up housing prices in the adjacent area. The important question here then is, why was a cheaper cladding installed? Why were residents neglected? What did this slow violence reveal about the class and racial inequalities that occur in gentrification processes today? Examining the reasons for the Grenfell Tower fire, both locally and globally, Ida Danawid writes that gentrification is a continuation of colonialism and the reconfiguration of the domestic space of empire. She points out that even Grenfell Road is named after Field Marshal Francis Grenfell, who was a British Army officer and Commander-in-Chief in South Africa. So this colonial legacy is even present in our street and building names, often without us even realising. Despite being the richest borough in the UK, Kensington Council failed to take action that would have prevented the fire from happening. This is where I say that both race and class are essential for understanding the slow violence. Just as Danawid states in her paper, of the 72 people who died in Grenfell, most victims were Arabs and Muslims, European migrants and refugees from the global south. It is also important to state that not all of Grenfell Tower was composed of council housing. There were privately owned flats at the top of the building. This emphasises that while it is important to discuss race and class and gentrification in the UK, it can also sometimes be incredibly complex because the social mixture of communities often in the same building or estate. After the fire, Dawn Foster from the New York Times published an article with the title, "Would a White British Community Have Burned in Grenfell Tower?" Foster identified how many of the residents of the tower felt targeted because of their race. She also emphasised class distinctions by saying that on the Lancaster West Estate, poverty rates are lowest among the white population at 20%. Both class and race played a role in the gentrification that occurred on the estate and leading up to the fire. As Foster states, reported failings in the run-up to the disaster has a clear class element, but also a racial one. But evident in Glass's analysis of gentrification in North Kensington, as I mentioned earlier, is this racial and ethnic inequality. Glass revealed how prejudicial behaviour or actions were used towards those from Irish and West Indian backgrounds. Although this inequality in the housing sector is ongoing, there is not enough gentrification research in the UK that focuses specifically on these issues. In contrast, in the US, there's far more scholarship on gentrification and racialised displacement, with scholars such as Wiley and Hamill looking specifically at ethnic discrimination in the housing sector, or more who research black gentrification as a protection of black neighbourhoods in the US. A potential reason for this gap in the literature is that gentrification operates in different ways in different cities. And while racialised displacement may appear one way in the US, it occurs in different ways in the UK. Also, as Loretta Lee states, people can have multiple class identities or identify as mixed race, biracial, or multiracial, and therefore more research is needed on these racial ethnic identities. We also need to consider how race is framed in state-led gentrification, which I think can only be really revealed with bottom-up research with residents. It is also difficult to examine race and gentrification in complete isolation, as class is fundamental to our housing experiences. Another of my participants, a 20-year-old resident on the Lancaster West Estate, who had witnessed the burning of her neighbours, said it was the first time I ever felt like a lower-class citizen. In the aftermath of the tragedy, Dana would argue that the media focused more specifically on class and neoliberalism, and they used gentrification as a key reason behind the tragedy without paying enough attention to racial inequality in the borough. While I do think that gentrification is a key factor here, I also recognise that racial inequality plays a significant role within this gentrification. Just as Glass identified in the 1960s, and as Grenfell has tragically revealed, it is predominantly poor minority ethnic groups that are most vulnerable to this process of gentrification. I conclude with a few key points, but as I say, it's a momentous topic which requires much more discussion, and I only touched the surface on some of these main points I've argued. Firstly, that the Grenfell Tower tragedy reveals the continuation of race and class inequalities and the exploitation and neglect of poor and minority ethnic groups in North Kensington, from Rachmanism in the 1950s to the slow violence that was used by the KCTMO. State Rachmanism and slow violence are methods of gentrification designed to remove those less socially and economically desirable. Investment in housing by the richest increases house and rent prices, changes the character of the area, and displaces the existing community. This gentrification has continually occurred in multiple ways since Glass coined the term in the 1960s. Post-Grenfell, the extremes of poverty in the borough have been exposed more widely, yet despite this, Kensington still has among the highest number of empty and second homes in the UK, and a lot of this is due to land banking, buy-to-leave and buy-to-let. So state-led gentrification by the KCTMO was exposing the changing of the Grenfell facade to beautify the estate, and by the decision to choose a cheaper cladding that failed health and safety requirements. We need more scholarship on the relationship between class, race, and gentrification in the UK. Can it be argued or shown that government in the UK is a continuation of colonial rule and that gentrification is a tool in the reconfiguration of domestic space? What is evident is that the Grenfell Tower fire encapsulates the vast racial and class inequality in our country and the tragic consequences of gentrification. Just to end, there's a list of references here, but there is, as I say, much more to be said about the topic, and I'm sure we'll learn a lot over the course of this conference. And also, as I'm in my second year of my PhD doing research, I'd also love to hear from any Kensington residents about their experiences of living in the borough. So do get in touch if this applies to you. And thank you for listening.
That was very good, Shada. even more so now we know that you're only in the second year of your PhD. That was excellent. Well done you. Some fantastic points made as well. Points that clearly have really contemporary resonance over the last few months, let alone the last few years. So really well done. There's some excellent work in there, and wish you all the best with the rest of your PhD. It's really, really good. Adrian, do we have any questions? Because I can't see any.
No, I don't think so. But can I ask Shada a question?
Yes, of course, absolutely.
Which is, I think you said you were a long-term resident of the borough yourself, and I'm just wondering, RBKC is a fairly unique borough in the sense that obviously there are areas of deprivation, as you referred to, but also areas of enormous wealth within very small space. And that's true in London generally, but in RBKC to an extreme level. I'm just wondering how does that fit into your overall analysis, if at all?
Yeah, I mean, it's actually, obviously I focus on Kensington because it's my home, and I was always interested in this. Actually, before Grenfell happened, I was researching the sort of gentrification that was happening on Kensington High Street. The reason why I look at facadism is because I'm considering this idea that a lot of the poverty that we associate with the different parts of Kensington are not just happening, say, on the estate, but behind different facades. So, for instance, like regulated tenants, statutory tenants living in the borough might be living behind the facades of quite beautiful Queen Anne architecture homes, but actually experience the same slow violence of property management companies and landlords that lots of people on council estates are also experiencing. So that's why I was really interested in the kind of contradiction, which, yeah, going back to the RBKC, often these communities are completely ignored. So that's why I've sort of focused and honed in on the whole of the borough and tried to look at all the different communities living within this very sort of small space.
And there's very much a racialised element to it, but of course that's alongside that we still have to say there is an issue around poverty, which is perhaps broader as well, and the interplay of the two, the one multiplies the other. Is that what you find?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Okay, really good. So no more questions at this point, Adrian?
No.
So Sam, he paused. Have we sorted Sam out? Sam Wetherell?
He's just emailing me saying he still can't get in.
I'm still trapped. He says here he's still trapped. He's emailed multiple times. He's going to follow the link. So hopefully, I'm sorry, everyone. I've just texted saying this is all going really well with the technology.
Well, in fact, while we're waiting for Sam Wetherell to join us, there's actually a question come up from Natalie O'Hara, if that's how you pronounce the name, for Sharda. So if I just pass that on and then Sharda can give her comment. Sharda, in your view, are the residents of North Kensington trusting the inquiry? Do they feel the inquiry adequately addresses the questions of inequality, racism and classism? And I'd be interested to know your answer to that myself.
From what I'm also following about the inquiry, just on the news, but also through people I know that who attend, I say absolutely no, they're not trusting a lot of what's going on in the inquiry. There was supposed to be a representative which is sort of chosen by Grenfell residents, and that didn't occur. And one of the key things that hasn't happened is that they believe that race really hasn't been considered at all in the inquiry so far. So no, I don't think there's a lot of issues with that, and it's ongoing. So there's a lot of petitions to try and have more representation and to address these issues and make sure that they're paramount. But no, I don't. The answer to that is a no in a nutshell.
We will come back to this because it feels like a never-ending kind of cycle with housing. You can pick up the same themes running all the way through from the 19th century, and particularly the 20th century, and even more so in the post-war period. This is the same depressing cycle. And the process alongside that, which alienates and keeps people very much at the margins. But we will come back to that. Thank you very much, Shadow. It was really good. So now we do have, all the way from York, Sam Wetherell. And Sam is going to be picking up on ideas around race. He looks initially at the US and this idea of redlining, and he's applying this, and he has applied this because he's already published on this subject, to race and housing in post-war Britain. So Sam is now going to talk about a history of high-density council housing and race in Britain. Sam.
Hello. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Fantastic. I'm so sorry about that. I was being admitted to the room as an observer, so I could hear everyone, but I couldn't communicate. It was like being, it was kind of like being dead and haunting you or something. It was incredibly surreal, or like some sort of strange dream. Fantastic. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Tracy. Yeah, I'll get started. So what I'm going to do over the next 15 minutes is tell a historical story that will help us understand the role that housing has played in entrenching and exacerbating racialized inequalities in Britain, laying the groundwork for the Grenfell disaster. And it builds really well on Sharda's really excellent paper that preceded this. So I'm going to begin, however, by talking briefly about the urban history of the United States, and in doing so set up a concept that I'm going to use throughout this talk. So allow me to begin with a very brief digression. In 1935, during the peak of the Great Depression, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal administration created a new organization tasked with underwriting millions of mortgages designed to restore confidence in an American housing market that had been effectively destroyed. In order to do this, this new federal body drew up color-coded maps of more than 200 American cities. If you look at the maps, the neighborhoods that were colored green or blue were deemed creditworthy, places where it was expected that homeowners would pay their debts. Those that were deemed too hazardous to be creditworthy were colored red. The maps were drawn at a time of unashamed white supremacy, and it's no surprise that the neighborhoods which were redlined tended to house African Americans. For more than a generation, the redlining of Black neighborhoods in urban America by both public bodies and private banks excluded millions of Black Americans from the privileges of homeownership. And for many American academics, activists, and commentators, the story I've just told is relatively well understood. Redlining has been a useful concept for Americans to understand and to resist the means by which both state and private capital conspired to restrict the ability of African Americans to buy houses, preventing millions from accessing a common route towards social mobility, capital ownership, and ontological security. And I've often wondered if we can tell a similar story in Britain about the ways that the built environment has exacerbated racialized inequality in ways that have laid the groundwork for disasters such as Grenfell. So what I'm going to do today is briefly sketch out what a history of redlining might look like in post-war Britain. I'm going to follow this thought experiment, if you like. And I should add before I begin, but I do not mean to deny the very specific ways that racial inequalities have manifested in Britain. Specifically, the ways that Britain's imperial history has produced a different kind of social formation to that of the United States. I'm not arguing for a comparative history on the basis of sociological essentialism or the determining effects of capital, but rather I think that redlining, when applied to Britain, invites a new way of thinking structurally and historically about the role of the built environment in reproducing longer-term racial inequalities in Britain. It's a term that activists, particularly those agitating for more substantive forms of justice for those who died in Grenfell, may wish to work with. So what would a history of redlining in Britain look like? So as many of us probably know, during the 14 years between the 1948 British Nationality Act and the 1962 Commonwealth Immigrants Act, Britain had effectively open borders with what remained of its disintegrating empire. And although people of color had lived in Britain for hundreds of years, this decade saw the arrival of significant numbers of new migrants from the West Indies and South Asia. Many first-generation migrants settled in lodging houses owned by their employers. Those who tried to rent on the private market were often at the mercy of white landlords, many of whom refused to accept Black lodgers or tenants. And overwhelmingly, this migrant generation lived in precarious and overcrowded conditions, shaped by poverty and by exclusion from other types of housing. In the early 1960s, compared with other city dwellers, Commonwealth migrants were more than 5 times more likely to live in overcrowded housing without exclusive access to a stove or a stink. Also, as many of us here probably know, the first 2 decades after the war marked the peak of Britain's experiment with mass public housing. In the first 20 years after the war, local authorities were building an average of 172,000 council homes a year. Council homes with indoor bathrooms, fitted kitchens and central heating systems modernized the domestic lives of millions of Britons. But despite their precarious living conditions, Commonwealth migrants struggled to gain access to this new supply of council houses in the 1950s and 1960s. Many first-generation migrants were unwilling to apply for council housing, not wanting to leave the relative safety of their neighbourhoods. Many found themselves at the bottom of waiting lists that were allocated based on the principle of first come, first serve, or based on the number of years a person had lived in a particular neighbourhood. But in many instances, more direct forms of racism played a role. In the mid-1960s, it was found that many housing authorities in London boroughs were deliberately moving white Britons up waiting lists at the expense of people of colour. Migrant families were often discriminated against by white council officers whose role was to inspect families to ascertain their fitness for council housing. And according to one investigation in 1965, these officials were often, quotes, baffled and, quotes, biased when faced with non-white people, and would, quotes, play it safe by giving applicants low marks. As a result of these barriers, people of colour were significantly underrepresented among council house tenants in the 1950s and 1960s. In 1961, just 4.3% of all Commonwealth migrants in the 6 largest cities in England and Wales were living in council housing, compared with 23% of all households. Another significant factor deterring people of colour from accessing council housing was the fear of violence and harassment. Studies of Pakistani migrants to Bradford and Glasgow from the 1970s show that a reluctance to apply for council housing was partly motivated by the fear of being left isolated and vulnerable on mostly white council estates. The first detailed study of racial harassment on council estates did not emerge until the mid-1980s. But among the most shocking finding of this report was the fact that more than half of all people of colour on council estates in Scotland had been victims of racist graffiti. Obviously, a series of race relations acts in 1965, 1968, and 1976 attempted to mitigate this housing crisis facing people of colour, banning discrimination by private landlords and by local authorities. However, concerns about residency criteria and community cohesion meant that when people of colour did manage to secure access to council housing in the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s, they tended to be allocated types of housing that were deemed to be undesirable. More specifically, while white applicants were allocated houses, people of colour tended to be allocated flats in high-density estates. In an investigation into housing practices in East London, housing practices in Hackney, the Commission for Racial Equality found that 77% of non-white tenants were living in flats on high-density estates in London, compared with just 56% of the total population. And in the late 1970s, Nottingham's Community Relations Council found that Caribbean migrants and their descendants were more than twice as likely to be housed in flats on high-density estates when compared with white applicants. And Britain's colour line even ran through the stairwells of tower blocks, with Black Britons tending to be allocated the least desirable flats on the very top or very bottom floors. So for all of these reasons, people of colour held a subordinate place within post-war public housing. And it's for this reason that the activist Sidney Jacobs, writing in 1985, referred to council housing as the British road to apartheid. While council housing modernised the lives of millions of white former slum dwellers, many migrants to Britain were either excluded from council housing entirely or concentrated on urban high-density estates. It was, however, what happened next that led to all the pieces of redlining falling into place as private capital as well as public bodies began to shape the experiences of those who had been allocated council housing. And this brings me to the final part of my talk. So in her first full year as Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher's government passed the 1980 Housing Act, arguably her most famous and most consequential piece of legislation, something that's probably familiar to many of the people in this talk. As we probably know, the Act gave every possible financial incentive for those in council houses to buy their home from the state. And the policy was an extraordinary success, initiating 1.3 million sales in its first 10 years, and forever changing the ownership structure of Britain's housing stock. Although the right to buy is most commonly associated with low-rise council houses, the same advantages were offered to those living in large tower blocks or older multi-storey estates, the kinds of spaces that people of colour were more likely to have been housed in. Here, however, much of the frustration of the government, efforts at incentivising residents to buy their homes, usually flats, were not necessarily as successful, were not nearly as successful. By 1987, local authorities had sold 865 houses, but only 49,000 flats. And flats comprised just over 5% of all sales, despite making up a third of all British public housing stock. And furthermore, most of these sales were concentrated in just a handful of London boroughs. By 1965, Birmingham City Council had sold just 314 of its more than 55,000 flats. Even with all of the financial incentives of the 1980 Act, flats were deemed undesirable or risky purchases. And this is partly because many mortgage providers refused on principle to those trying to sell flats on council estates. Building societies such as Halifax, when pressured by the government, cited the difficulty of maintaining, managing, and policing communal areas as grounds for their refusal. By the early 1990s, the Chelsea Building Society were turning down any applications for loans from those living in buildings, but were less than 60% owner-occupied. So despite the fact that housing loans from banks increased tenfold in the decade after 1978, a period which saw an increasing overlap between the roles of building societies and banks, many of those living in high-density urban council estates did not have access to this new glut of capital. Mortgage lenders were happy to provide loans to those buying apartments in the new luxury developments that were being built in the 1980s in places like the former Docklands of London, but were loath to lend to those in local authority tower blocks. The kinds of spaces where people of colour were overrepresented as a result of local authority actions in the 1950s, 1960s and 1970s were also some of the most difficult places for which to secure mortgages. So we can see redlining in Britain then as the outcome of two historical processes. First, people of colour occupied a subordinate position within the massive expansion of council housing between the 1940s and the 1970s. During this period, people of colour were underrepresented in council housing across the board, shunted to the bottom of waiting lists, discriminated against by visitation officers, alienated by complex bureaucracies, and rightfully fearful of being left isolated and vulnerable on predominantly white estates. Even as access to housing improved over the 1960s and 1970s, people of colour were disproportionately housed in flats on urban high-density housing estates. So that's the first process. The second process is when council tenants were given enormous incentives to purchase their homes from local authorities at heavily discounted rates. Those living in high-density flats struggled to buy their homes and then sell them on, and were frequently snubbed by mortgage lenders. So it seems clear that structural forces operating both during the period we think of as Britain's welfare state, or its post-war social democratic period, and during the period of Thatcherism, or if you like, neoliberalism, have meant that white Britons have disproportionately benefited from home ownership and the financial benefits that it entails. Non-white Britons tended to lose out from both the modernizing processes of mid-century state-led economic development, as well as the spoils of financialized, property-driven late 20th century private wealth. If Margaret Thatcher's intent was to create a property-owning democracy, various historical forces converged to make this property-based notion of citizenship a privilege enjoyed by white Britons. With property wealth having now become the second most significant source of wealth in Britain, and with house price increases significantly outstripping wage increases over the last generation, the average house now costing 9 times more in 2019 than it did in 1980, these structural forces have had demonstrably negative effects on the lives of many people of colour in Britain. So this then is how we might use the term redlining to make sense of British history. I haven't addressed the Grenfell disaster directly, but what I hope to have sketched out is a way that the tragedy can be situated in a much longer history. It's still the case, for example, that children living above the 4th floor in Britain are more likely than not to be Black or Asian. In 2014, the American journalist Ta-Nehisi Coates called for financial reparations to be paid to Black Americans, not just to address the history of slavery, but also for the money and security lost by decades of being subject to a racially unequal housing market. A serious reckoning with the Grenfell disaster that might establish something like justice for those who died would also need to address this post-war history. And the story I've told might be a small part of a broader claim for long-term reparative justice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sam. I think that was an excellent way of rounding off today's papers. Really good, really interesting, really bringing it kind of the story, indeed, along with Sharda, bringing the kind of story right up to the present day, really, I think it's fair to say. Because the issues that you're looking at, historical issues that everybody's been looking at today, really do resonate from the past, really do resonate with the current situation around housing. Now, any particular questions for Sam before we continue, Adrian?
Sorry, no. Perhaps we should throw it open with the more general questions now.
I'll just kind of provide a brief summary, and then I'll hand it over to you, and we'll go into a general discussion. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So again, I'd like to thank even all the speakers. Excellent papers, really good papers, exploring a range of issues around mass housing, around the impact of the private sector, structural issues, often shaping policy, and indeed shaping access, affecting access to housing, gentrification as part of those structures and processes, as well as the broader kind of emergence of policies, often reactive, often determined by short-term, I think it's fair to say, political needs. This gives us a kind of broader understanding as to why housing and tenants have and are still showing broadly similar problems and challenges and issues indeed. I think what we've seen today is a recurrent series of structural problems, as Sam was mentioning there in the last paper. It's the same problems because they are deeply embedded. They are structural problems. And it's not just economic problems, although that's obviously a major issue because that creates the imbalances, it creates and maintains the poverty and the deprivation that most people in social housing, in low-grade social housing now suffer, many of them. But also, I think it frames and maintains the kind of socio-cultural attitudes and problems and issues, attitudes towards the poor. And we see those attitudes, even today, even when someone social housing tenants have become second-class citizens. And that's quite clear in the papers, in some of the papers, how and why that's happened over a long period of time. The social and cultural perceptions of tenants persist. There could be inner city tenants, there can be tenants on housing estates across the UK. Stigma and lazy stereotypes continue to frame mindsets. And indeed, what I find quite repulsive actually is that much of this has become the stuff of cheap television programmes, as some viewers find people existing in poverty, living in rundown houses, sometimes on former council estates, strangely entertaining. We see it in a series of programmes over the last few years. We saw it most notoriously on Channel 4 a few years ago. So I think it really is a kind of problem and an issue that never seems to that has never been effectively challenged. And I could go back to the 19th century and I could talk about the undeserving poor and various other, the submerged tenth. But that's another issue, the issue of language that gives us a particular structure around negative stereotypes. But again, it kind of all comes together and is all driven and maintained by a whole series of economic and social policies and cultural attitudes. So at that point, Adrian, would you like to pick up the questions?
Yeah. Thanks, Peter. What I was planning to do was to go through the various questions that have been raised, and then if I could ask the panelists on the right-hand side of your screen, you should have a list of the panelists, and you can raise your hand if you want to speak, rather than all speaking at once. And some of the questions are directed at particular panelists, in which case I will direct them there. But otherwise, I will ask you to raise your hand. And just before we do that, one of our attendees, Shelley, sent me a message saying she'd like to feed in on behalf of the local residents. I don't know if is it possible to do that technologically? Does anyone know? Can she be brought to the microphone, as it were?
Yes, I'm going to try and do that now. Okay, Shelley, you should be able to speak now.
Shelley?
Shelley?
Can you hear?
Very faint.
Okay, I shall try again. Can you hear me now?
That's perfect.
We sorted you out, Shelley. That's great to see. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Thanks for inviting me.
You're
Right. Okay, I shall try and be brief. I don't know if I'm talking on behalf of the community rather than being a member in this community and being really quite involved in what's going on. What I want to say, well, first of all, you know, my passport to coming into this Notting Dale, which was as we said, very, very run down, was through being primarily, first of all, a squatter with a child, and I had nowhere to go, and we squatted one of those dilapidated houses, and so it went on. We then fought our corner and won a case with GLC, and we ended up as a housing cooperative, first of all, as an independent state called Frestonia, and then if you like, we are now a housing cooperative and we run our own affairs, so we are a community. However, you know, Grenfell is just hovering over, you know, over us. It's 5 minutes walk from here, and I can see it when I come out of my house, you know, right at my doorstep. I want to say that as a community, yes, first of all, what was addressed is the fact that there is very little confidence and trust in authorities, and that's very true here and very justified. There is a lot of resentment and a lot of anger because I was a part of the campaign to warn against any possible disaster in Grenfell before it even happened. But equally, I want to say that in its adverse effect is that it's really strengthening the community. There's something of real resilience here. And also, I would say, a sense of pride in being who we are here. And, you know, a sense of we are not going to be beaten by this very Tory, sorry to be so political, Kensington and Chelsea borough. I myself live right on the edge of in between social housing and some very amazing houses at the back of Holland Park. So, I mean, you know, I literally 2 minutes walk and I'm on the, if you like, on the other side. So I don't see it on the other side. I am aiming towards integration. So I hope what I'm saying is helpful here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shelley. I thought that was very helpful, very useful. Would anybody like to respond to that? I'm thinking Shard in particular there. Would you like to say anything?
Yeah, I think that was really eloquently said. And it's exactly the experience that I've had just speaking to people, friends of mine who are on this estate, but also through kind of my interviews with various residents, that there's the sense of community is incredible after the tragedy happened, but also the people I spoke to, and this comes to the idea of like class, they didn't feel that they were of a sort of working class, lower income groups. There was a sense of integration. There was a sense of kind of being together and being in a mixed community. And actually the way in which Grenfell was exposed on the news and the way lots of residents were talked about made them feel like they now belong somewhere. It's like a sort of, lower class citizen, as one of my residents said, when actually that was not the way a lot of people thought at the time. And I think it's really important to consider how people actually see themselves rather than putting labels on, particularly class labels, on people who live in certain areas. So yeah, I think that Shelley completely encapsulated everything that I've seen myself and have heard from people on the estate.
Thank you very much, Sharda. Adrian.
Right, so going to the questions we've had in, Carl Makin said in relation to Miles's presentation did Miles, so perhaps ask Miles to comment on this first, and then others may want to comment as well. Did he think that there was a chance that other models and solutions, for example, the Swedish cooperative model, could have been applied in the UK to meet the demands of slum clearance?
Well, yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I think all of these things are all linked together, and organizational aspects, the locational thing. Slum clearance. The emphasis on slum clearance is something that's almost exclusively associated with Anglophone countries. So you only get these kind of public housing authorities doing large-scale slum clearance. So it's a slightly unfamiliar idea to think of a sort of Swedish style, or the almost any country. For example, in the Netherlands, local housing companies arranged by religious grouping, or that kind of thing. Thinking of those being applied to large-scale slum clearance, because slum clearance is such an Anglophone thing, an Anglosphere thing. But I'm sure it certainly could have been. In Northern Ireland, that there was a sort of slum clearance program, although it was very much dogged by religio-political issues, and that was dealt with by a different organisation called the Northern Ireland Housing Trust, which was a sort of something a little bit more like some of the kind of national arm's length authorities in some other countries. Not a co-op, it was certainly a public body, and it then became the Northern Ireland Housing Executive. Council housing in Northern Ireland didn't really kind of get off the ground very much absolutely, I'm sure it could have been, but generally speaking, there are some Swedish cities where there was actually some municipal housing, for example, Örebro. But I'm sure it could have, and I'm sure it would have worked if it had, because it would have depoliticized things. It would have kept things at arm's length. But it's just a completely hypothetical thing. Yeah.
Would any of the other panelists like to comment on that point, or shall we move on? Right, then the next question was from Craig Gurney, who reminds us that the news has reported overnight a fire in a 30-storey tower block in South Korea. And he says that the images are eerily familiar, and that international conversations about regulation and governance of high-rise will surely follow. Would any of the panelists like to comment on not necessarily on that specific incident, but on the wider question of how our housing issues and problems relate to those which are occurring in other countries, particularly in relation to tower blocks and things? Right.
Perhaps America?
Yeah.
Dan, do you think?
I guess that one thing to say, perhaps, in response to that is that, the experience of sort of public high-rise building all produced through a sort of central period of the 20th century is absolutely not, distinctive just to Britain, and that, maybe less so the United States, but certainly, across Western Europe, across parts of the global South, across Latin America, is very familiar types of housing that raise very similar kinds of questions that are built to answer similar questions about community, density, public ownership, things like that. But I don't have anything really much beyond that. Miles is probably much more of an expert than I am in this.
I don't know whether, can people hear me, my sound just now? Yeah, certainly I don't know about the specifics of this Korean fire, but certainly in high density Asian places, it's not normal to overclad buildings. I don't know whether the Korean building was overcladded at all. Overcladding seems the absolutely decisive thing. In Hong Kong, people were, as I said, 41-storey blocks with 800 flats are the norm for public housing. people, they were absolutely baffled and horrified by the Grenfell thing, because they thought, how on earth, what on earth drove people to put cladding on the overcladding on the outside of a building? In Hong Kong, it's taken as axiomatic that the external, the concrete structure of the building is exposed on the outside, and as indeed are all the kind of the drainage systems and the fire systems and so on. And the idea that you would cover them up by something. So I personally think this is more a problem of countries where kind of slightly crazy ideas of doing up buildings in potentially deadly ways can be allowed through by the building regulations. Thankfully, not possible in Scotland, because that was was stopped in 2005. But I think it's England as opposed to Asian countries. It's interesting to see what the circumstances in South Korea are.
Thank you. I've got among the panelists, Vanessa and then James.
So it was a very brief comment, Peter. It's to make the point that Miles has just made about the cladding not being possible in Scotland, but also to give a plug for next week's seminar, where we actually do have some international perspectives on regulation of buildings. So some of this question may possibly be dealt with next week.
And then James.
Yeah, I was just going to briefly say that I think when we talk about, like there's been this move towards recladding these buildings and turn them into something different. You see it also with sort of like urban splash redevelopment of certain properties like Park Hill and things like that. Even though high-rise council housing is actually always a very small part of the social housing stock in this country, it's becomes incredibly emblematic in a really, really unpleasant way, and it becomes tied up with the notion of what Guy Ortolano called the sort of the modernism of the welfare state. And in that way, it's almost that the stigmas, now we've not really talked about the stigma of the buildings very much, but the stigma of the buildings, trying to sort of change that through these kind of facile means has led us down this path. So in lots of ways, our prejudices that we've talked about developing towards tenants have been spatialized in a certain sense, and trying to sort of roll that back without demolishing everything and building something different is part of the process. It's a work. So you can see the kind of the physical outputs and these physical flaws, I think, as a part of sort of a materialization of those types of prejudices.
Thank you, James. And could I ask panelists to lower their hand once they've made a contribution, unless they want to contribute again. And I've got a comment here from one of our attendees, Shane Ewan, who is, I think, giving a paper next week, who says a number of fatal fires in Korea, Brazil and the US tower blocks in the early 1970s acted as an impetus for government-sponsored research into fire safety in the UK, especially by part of the Building Research Establishment, which is the BRE is going to be the subject of some evidence in the second module of our inquiry. So thanks for that, Shane. Right, so going back to the questions then. So a general question from Natalie O'Hara, which a number of panelists might like to comment on. She says this: how would you differentiate between negative attitudes rooted in perceptions against social housing residents on the one hand, and attitudes rooted in plain racism and classism on the other hand? Would anyone like to comment on that? No? Right. So James, you were going to comment. James?
Yeah, well, I was sort of politely waiting for maybe Sam or Shada to come in or something who might know a bit more about some specifics. But I was going to say, as a historian who spent quite, like 10 years sort of studying this kind of stuff, and I've never really written about race, but the thing that comes up to the top for me again and again and again, is that whilst, yeah, there are absolutely specifics, there is from probably the end of the 19th century right up till now, you just see exactly the same trope being just kind of repackaged and just shot out again and again. So what the ideas of an undeserving or an ungrateful or an uncivilizable tenant, in the 20s or 30s, they might not be the same person. It might not be the same identifiable individual, but the way that they're talked about is exactly the same. So the one thing I do note from sort of the back end of my work, which is not stuff I've published, is that the language that surrounds how you make those differences function. So there's a lot of stuff about working class people in the 20s and 30s being dirty and things like that. So what you get then in say the 60s and 70s, I'd see, is comments about things like the smells of foods and things like that. But they just very much just kind of like fit in the same blocks in to me. I'd love to know if someone's got an idea about, the real specifics and how they're different, because they always look like the same sort of prejudice, just repackaged in lots of ways by people to me.
I agree as well. I mean, this prejudice as I keep saying, is a prejudice against the poor that you can see very early on in the 19th century. And you can see it actually in the new Poor Law from 1834. And the language that's used is a language that effectively criminalises the poor, criminalises a particular group of the poor, the pauper, the undeserving poor, the submerged tenth. And as I say, we then go in, as James has just said, into the 20th century, and we're talking about, certainly after the war, we're talking about the scroungers, and then we're talking about areas as dumping grounds where you put problem families. So it's the same thing. It's just almost repackaged in terms of the use of language, but it's a language that is clearly has connotations of the same kind of negative stereotypes. And it's a language that's used in association with people from particular areas. You become damned by association. I've worked on Toxteth in the 60s and 70s. And so if you put you're applying for a job, you're applying for credit, and you put your postcode down as Liverpool 8, you were very unlikely to get that job or to get credit, to get access to services, because of this prejudice, this inbuilt prejudice and discrimination around areas. And that is reinforced very often by the type of housing that's there and by the way that housing is managed or mismanaged.
Thank you, Peter. Would either Sharda or Eva like to say anything about that question before we move on?
I had something potentially. I don't know if. Oh, sorry, Eva.
Well, you go ahead. So you go ahead first.
Are you sure?
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, I don't have a huge amount. I just wanted to add a little bit to what Jim and Peter were saying. I mean, one theoretical framework for thinking about this question of the ways in which inequalities of race permeate down into inequalities of class, and then I realized in the built environment is to think about a term that comes out of American Black critical theory, originally dating back to W.B. Du Bois, the sort of turn of the century American Black civil rights leader and intellectual, which is the idea of what's been called racial capitalism, which is also associated with Cedric Robinson in the 1970s and 80s. But basically, this is the sort of idea that that inequalities in the social order, inequalities grounded in race and produced, the British context through empire and the American context through a domestic history of slavery, sort of shape the ways that inequalities of class are then realized. So some of the same ways of thinking about, of policing, of judging, of discriminating against, in all of the sort of mundane and day-to-day ways that Jim and Peter mentioned, the ways that are sort of constantly humming along in the background of sort of the British discourse, are sort of reinforcing each other. So I think that to answer the original question, these questions of what came first. Was it racial discrimination or spatial discrimination, if you like? It's a sort of a chicken and egg thing. It's this constant process of mutual reinforcement and intensification, I think. So that's all I'd add, really.
Eva?
Yes, well, I've been thinking about this kind of idea of what role the architecture actually plays in all this. And as an architectural historian, and I think there's a second question that's coming in as well that has to do with the listed buildings. And I mean, one of the things that my paper was also trying to sort of move a little bit towards was the fact that in the end, the kind of, Trellis Tower gets listed grade 2 star, the other areas get put under conservation area, and so these bits kind of, because they're ossified, because they can't really change, become something also because there's perhaps press involved and controversy in this. It draws people's attention, while the other housing estates like the Lancaster West estate kind of just stays unnoticed. And that the buildings themselves, as sort of, we were sort of, as in this question, becomes kind of iconic for the welfare state, as we've commented on, and symbolic of that. Although actually, if we look at them more closely now, and with all of the, privatization of flats, they're not just only social housing anymore. And one of the things I'm actually quite interested in, I wonder if one of you has the answer for this, is how many of the homes in Grenfell Tower were actually still local authority? What was the percentage of that? And how many were owned by housing associations, and how many were in private ownership? I mean, this whole idea of gentrification, I think the Grenfell Tower discussion is starting to blow that whole thing apart, because what's going on in North Kensington is far more extreme, with the kind of the wealthy people that are moving in. This is not just kind of middle class people anymore. This is something far more different. And there were all kinds of different people living in Grenfell Tower that had all kinds of, and I know there was a sort of an overbias in terms of the racial profiling, but if you go into what the people worked, a lot of them were very educated. This is not, I mean, I would try to argue that this is not really a slum. And then we need to look at it much more carefully to think, well, what is it then? What is actually going on when the housing becomes so unsafe? And the responsibility of the architecture in doing this.
Charlotte, did you want to say anything on that question, or because if not, there's the next question on the list actually fits quite neatly into what we've just been talking about. Charlotte, did you want to say anything?
No, I agree with what's been said, so I'm happy to answer, I think, the next question you're gonna. Right.
Okay. So the next question, which sort of merges into one or two points that's just been made, is Luke Decker says, why have the Brown and Goldfinger council estates like Trellis Tower and the City of London estates like the Barbican? Sorry, Eva.
Yeah, no, I just want, go ahead, finish it. But
fared better than other estates. Is it to do with their superior formalistic design? Is it to do with an appreciation of the design in the collective memory, or is it to do with the wider privatisation on those estates than elsewhere? Who'd like to have a go at that first? Eva.
May I please answer that one? I had to do, before I started working as an academic, I worked in heritage, and I worked for almost 10 years for the 20th Century Society, and the Barbican, listing of the Barbican, that happened after my application. I was on the listed building management guidelines for this building, and also for the Golden Lane estate, where Barbican being not really social housing, and the Golden Lane estate being social housing, very selective for key workers, not for big families. They built them out of the scheme as social cleansing. But anyway, some very interesting architectural examples, So I mean, I am very interested in exactly this kind of question. So if something gets put under historic protection, are we automatically sterilizing it in some way for the the groups that were intended to be housed, if it's happening to social housing? Are we sterilizing these things? And this is a very odd question because we also want them preserved. We don't want them knocked down. A lot of the listing of post-war housing is because they're at risk of being knocked down and the sites sold off and build up with private housing. So this is really complicated. This is tremendously complicated. And the problem with the listing is that the actual use is not protected. And I've been also working with the Spit Theatre Company in North Kensington and their workshops for young people that live also on housing estates in this area. And so I've brought these topics up through the workshops with them. That's then also fed back in with my teaching at the Bartlett. But I mean, this is really complicated. This is not just, this is incredibly complicated. But I'd like to hear Sharda now on this. So.
Well, I mean, I think you're the expert on this particular one. I agree with what you're saying. I think that it's a really interesting point you made about what gets listed, and the kind of the actual fact that a lot of these buildings, like Grenfell Tower, were built, like I say in the presentation, with strength in mind. That they actually were kind of purpose built, strong buildings. But yeah, there is. I think a lot of it to do. I don't know the percentage that you asked earlier about how many of the properties were in private ownership. Unfortunately, I don't know. I just know that there were, and which is why I talk about there being kind of social mix in the building, and it's not as clear cut as everybody was on. It was all part of council housing. So yeah, I don't know about that particular thing, but I do think that the kind of privatization around the area and the fact that they wanted to improve the whole of Lancaster estate. You had the academy going up, you had the new leisure centre. So there was an element of the people who lived on the estate and they couldn't make any decisions about what happened with the cladding. They had no decision-making process within that at all. And I think that there was a distinction between somewhere like Grenfell, where all of that happened to kind of beautify the area, to improve it, to gentrify it, whereas Trellick Tower has gone down because of its heritage listing as being a sort of tourist site in London, and it has more there's more focus on that in the sense of it, being a tourist industry, whereas people in Lancaster estate didn't have that sort of prestige around the area. So the stuff that happened to them really happened, like I said, without their consent, and that's why that enabled that to happen. And I think states like that often are neglected because of those reasons.
Would any other panelists like to comment on that question about Trellick Tower, etc., or shall we move on? No? Okay. And then if it's possible to do so, can we bring in, please, from the audience, Gus John, who has something he wants to say and who's raised a number of questions in the Q&A, but might be easier if he puts his own points.
Hello, Gus.
Hello, Gus. We can see you after a fashion. Can you hear us?
He's muted himself.
All right.
You've muted yourself again, Gus. No.
Hello.
Right, there you go.
Hello.
Hello. Can I just introduce you, Gus? Gus is a professor. He's a professor at Coventry. He's now emeritus professor, I think. Is that right, Gus? Can you hear us?
Jesus.
You there, Gus? No, you're on, off. Try and keep it unmuted. Can you hear us?
Hello.
Right, we can hear you now, Gus.
Yeah.
Can you hear us, Gus? Clearly not.
I can't hear you. You can't hear me.
We can hear you. We can hear you.
Adrian, I can't hear you.
Right, we can hear you. So just
What the hell is going on here? Okay, so I want to say, first of all, thank you to the speakers for these wonderful, wonderful papers. I just want to make a link between Shada and Sam's and James's presentations. It seems to me that framed around all of this is the whole process of racializing immigration, which happened after 1948 and particularly 1962, and the way in which race has remained as a trope at the back of all of this, influencing to a very large extent how local authorities saw the requests of Black people for housing and the way they dealt with them once they were in social housing. One of the things that's always irritated me really is the lack of attention councils paid to the sort of racial hostility that Black tenants faced day by day on housing estates particularly. To get white perpetrators removed by the council was virtually impossible in many cases, unless, of course, the police got involved because of some matter to do with violence and so on. So, to a very large extent, what we experienced in the 50s and 60s was visited upon, and is still being done so now, those people who came afterwards as refugees and asylum seekers. In other words, this notion of the undeserving scrounger was used to determine how the nation as a whole should look at the requests of people coming in, not as economic migrants necessarily, but as refugees and asylum seekers. And it is that caused the Home Office in its dispersal policies to send refugees and asylum seekers to areas where there were known racist groups. I worked at the University of Strathclyde for 10 years. And while in Glasgow, there were people being put on the Mary Hill estate and those places who were losing their lives because of racism on the part of white Glaswegians who resented the fact that they were coming there and so-called stealing our houses and so on. The other point I want to make is that there has not been very much discourse, whether in the literature or generally, about the fact that most people coming from the global south had a totally different attitude towards housing and housing ownership than in Britain or in Europe. In other words, we were born in a house, it remained a family house until everybody died, pretty much. And the idea of houses being some kind of a capital that you exchanged for profit and so on, in other words, part of your general assets, was pretty alien to most of us. To the extent that the resistance to council housing was very similar to the abhorrence many of my parents' generation had to being on the dole. We didn't see ourselves as scroungers, nor did we necessarily want anything from the state, including housing. So to a very large extent, those negative tropes, which were shaped by racism, were piled upon us without anybody having regard for the fact that what we wanted to do was to be given opportunities, work, buy our own homes, run our lives without depending on the state in any way. And I just wondered whether any of the speakers would like to comment on the relationship between the aspirations of Black people, whether it be from South Asia or the Caribbean, and the manner in which we were in a sense corralled into these social arrangements, housing particularly, where all sorts of things were piled upon us that we didn't necessarily want to identify with.
Thank you, Gus. Who'd like to comment on that amongst the panelists?
Perhaps Sam. Picking on you, Sam.
Thanks so much, Gus. That was a really fascinating set of points and contributions. I mean, I don't really have much to add beyond that, other than to say that I think that's a much better answer, or maybe the best answer we have to the question we had earlier about the difference between, if you like, spatial and racial forms of prejudice and attitudes of Britain. Yeah, I mean, I think you know, what you've said speaks a little bit to the final point I was trying to make in my paper, in the ways in which you know, we talk about right to buy in Britain, and more broadly the creation of the idea of a property owning democracy as this you know, this engine for maybe a sort of once only working class form of like Thatcherite social mobility, right, in which, you know, individuals can buy their homes from the state and then become landlords, sell them 20 or 30 years later. But that's a sort of one-time thing. It's a thing that was possible for a particular generation of people. And I guess what I tried to show is how there being enormous privileges of that were, for various longer-term structural reasons, concentrated among white people. So when we think about the sort of Thatcherite, the sort of myth of, if you like, of Thatcherite white working class social mobility organized through property ownership, so many different forces conspired to make that a white ideal. And I think that your point about the different ways that different migrant communities thought about housing and ownership speaks so well to that, and is really interesting. Yeah, so thank you. That was fascinating to hear. I don't have a huge amount more than that to add.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. Sorry, Alan. I know you've been looking at Birmingham, and there are particular issues in Birmingham.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. In Birmingham, the city council in the early '60s explicitly designated certain districts of the city as being the only ones in which HMO housing, new HMO developments would be allowed. Official, you know, which was an unofficial attempt to restrict new non-white immigrants to the city into particular districts, which has actually set the very, because Birmingham has a particularly stark patterns of residential ethnic segregation, and you know it still does, and the general pattern follows to a significant extent those that the council effectively mapped out in the early '60s. And then in the later '60s, you also had, there was an attempt by a different council administration by this point. The earlier one was a Labour administration, this was by a Conservative administration, to introduce overt racial ethnic segregation into council housing. They found they weren't actually allowed to do that by this legally, but so the attitude still underpinned a lot of the administration of council housing in the city in the sort of later '60s, early '70s. And there was a remark by Anthony Beaumont-Dark, who would later be a Conservative MP, but who at the time was the chairman of the Housing Committee, that were it not for the Nazis, the word ghetto would not have all these negative connotations. They had this attitude that it was a good idea to try to force ethnic minorities into specific districts and keep them there, and therefore keep the rest of the city a white city, even if they couldn't have the whole city like that. For various reasons, this is probably more extreme in Birmingham than in most other large urban areas, the sort of racial tensions, racial sort of politics and stuff was considerably more acute in the urban West Midlands than was normal elsewhere. But I suspect the general pattern, you could certainly see echoes of it elsewhere.
Thank you very much, Alan. Can I just say something? Gus is having loads of problems with hearing. This session is being recorded, and along with the papers, it will be going on the website. So if anybody's missed anything, any parts of it, any sections of it, the papers and the recording will be available later. Adrian.
So when you say Adrian, Peter,
do you have any more questions? Sorry.
I think we're sort of towards the end of time, aren't we? On questions,
we're getting there. I just wonder if there's any more final questions.
There's a couple of comments rather than questions, which Amanda Nichols points out that Grenfell United have asked for people to contact the Cabinet Office to press for the appointment of the inquiry's third panel member. And gives the email address at the Cabinet Office there. And just for anyone who's not aware of this particular saga, the previous Prime Minister, Theresa May, undertook that in addition to the retired judge, there would be 2 panel members with experience of social housing and allied issues. That 2 were appointed, and at the end of last year, one of them dropped out, and there was then an attempt to appoint someone who was found to have a conflict of interest, and since then this has been, I think, lost in the thickets of Brexit and coronavirus. So that may be of interest. Craig, so anonymous attendee, so whoever that may be, says Eva raises an interesting question about whether race, class, etc. are really that relevant to Grenfell. Many of the high-rise buildings that have combustible cladding are expensive / high specification buildings, and their rich owners are struggling to have the cladding removed. This suggests that the building industry regulation is the problem, and residents have a problem whether they're rich or poor, which is why next week's discussion should be very interesting. So as Vanessa's already trailed for next week, we are talking about regulation and deregulation next week, which is obviously an interest of wider, a topic of wider interest. Right. I think, Peter, that's pretty much it on the questions. I think we've gone to everyone who has raised a question at least once.
Excellent. Okay, thank you very much, Adrian. Okay, just by way of wrapping things up, again, I mean, this session, these papers have gone very, very quickly, and that's always a good sign, because that means they have truly been really engaging, really relevant, and very, very interesting, with lots of really good pertinent points that have been made throughout. So I'd like to thank the speakers, and of course, I'd like to thank everybody who's been along today. We have been getting some positive comments and feedback. I really hope you've got something from this, and I really hope that you'll be joining us again next week. So for next week's session, you've got to register again, and next week's session will be on the historical patterns of building regulation and deregulation, and that will be chaired by Judy Stevenson. So she has organised, and she'll be chairing that session, and I hope to see you all again. In the meantime, thank you all very, very much. It's been a very enjoyable session. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Peter.
Bye.
Thanks, Adrian.